I was just obsessed with all things fantasy. So I made this tabletop role-playing game called Adventure Quest.
If God cedes reality to our desire to kill him, then it's not only the end of God, it's the end of everything that depends on him as well.
Another thing growing up is that anytime we'd watch a movie, he would dig into all the meanings in the movie. And I'd be like, just let me watch a movie. Just let me escape.
The inevitability of being mortally opposed is a given, irrespective of what tradition that you want to inhabit. The $1 million question is...
How's it going, everybody? Welcome to our first podcast. My name is Peter. I'm joined by my dad.
My name's Hans.
Yeah, and today we're doing our first podcast episode. Really excited for this. And so one of the reasons we started this channel is because we feel like as a culture, just as people in general, our lives are becoming more and more incomprehensible to each other, and we're labeling each other as the other more and more.
Yeah, and so each one of us, just as we live like in the course of our lives, are aware or have a sense of like a growing fragmentation in which the meanings kind of undergird our lives are becoming increasingly incomprehensible to one another. And rather than kind of conceding the fragmentation or the alienation, one of the things that we wanted to do is say, hey, look, as we're experiencing this fragmentation, are there any kind of shared meanings that we have with people that believe differently from us or think about the world differently than us? And can we pay attention to the different kinds of meanings that we're encountering and actually work through them ourselves, like as a father and a son, and then kind of craft new ways of talking with one another that don't lead so easily to an increasing fragmentation. And one of the things that we found is that there are often shared meanings that different people have, even that have wildly different beliefs, that if you actually identify them and just begin to talk about them, it'll lead to better conversations for the people that are involved.
Yeah, and that's something we're practicing between us, but also it's something that we're inviting you guys into. And yeah, we're here to be stretched and to grow and to be challenged and also to connect in better ways than we have before. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, so one of the ways that we actually experience a mutual incomprehensibility is in the way that people outside the Christian tradition understand the Old Testament and Old Testament stories. I mean, Richard Dawkins has that famous quote from his book, The God Delusion, about how the God of the Old Testament is like a megalomaniac. Can't quite get the word all out, but y'all know what it is. You can find it. Even reading the word yourself, you'll come across stories where if you're just reading straight through, you'll find stories that just like make your hair stand on edge and you're just like, I don't even know what to make of this.
Yeah.
I mean, even in my own experience, I mean, I've read across stuff that takes me years and years to sort through. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we wanted to do in our first episode is actually lean into one of the most crazy stories in the Old Testament. It's from Genesis 22, and it's the passage where God tells Abraham to offer up your son Isaac as a sacrifice.
Yeah. And so if you are skeptical of the Christian faith, then you're welcome here. One thing we want to do is, I know personally for me, one painful thing I experienced during my time in the church is when a passage would be preached on that posed some really hard questions to anyone who's taking it seriously and stuff like that, but they'd kind of get glossed over and ignored. So if you're here as a skeptic, we want to ask those really hard questions and take them seriously and get meaningful answers. And then on the flip side, if you're a Christian, I hope that you can, be edified by the same thing, because I'm sure you've experienced something similar in your own experience. So yeah. So before we jump into that, I'm just going to do a quick little about us. My name is Peter. He's my dad, obviously, as you already know. And I love guitar. I love fantasy stories. I started a company a few years ago called Acrylic University, and we teach people how to paint online. So that's what I do for work. It's a lot of fun. And I grew up in the church because my dad's a pastor. So we were born and raised in the church, our whole lives. And when I kind of moved out, I kind of circled out of the church for various different reasons. Mainly, I didn't feel like I had the Bible explained to me in a way that was well enough that I could understand it for myself and it would be meaningful to me. And so it felt like I was just believing something that wasn't really connecting, and I have a hard time getting meaning out of things that I don't understand, that I can't wrap my head around. Since then, I've started to kind of circle back and really tackle the meanings, because I think there's something important there if we're willing to take the time to wrestle through the issues. So that's kind of the process I'm in right now. And yeah.
Awesome. So my name's Hans, and Peter's my son. I was born and raised in the church as well. From the time I was born till the time I left home, my family had been through 9 different churches, 7 of which involved a serious division or split. Part of that journey as well is going through what I would regard as 2 apocalyptic cults. and the process of journeying in was pretty intense, but coming out was mind shattering in a lot of ways. But part of that journey involved paying really close attention to what I was taught and just learning to think through the questions. One of the things that was actually really painful about the journey, I kind of became aware of, say, years later after I came out and just was continually reflecting on what had happened. But it was a really lonely journey. And one of the things that was lonely about it is that even though I had my family to go through many of the seasons and kind of sorting through the meanings together, there wasn't a lot of people outside of the groups that I interacted with extensively. And it would have been really cool to have taken the journey with somebody who had their head on straight, but also who wouldn't shame me for what I believed and what I was grappling with, and could actually just pay attention to my thought world and understand the thought world of the group that I was in, and kind of help me take the small steps that you have to take when you're trying to come out of something like that.
So before we launch into the actual text, we're going to tell you about a story that we experienced that was really illuminating, and has kind of been an integral part of helping us make sense of the Abraham and Isaac story. And it comes from a really, really funny story, a really funny backstory. So 8 or 9 years ago, when I was probably 13 or 14, I made this game called Adventure Quest, and it was a tabletop role-playing game inspired by Aragon and Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, because I loved fantasy books so much. I mean, I read Lord of the Rings multiple times in 3rd grade. I read Aragon. I was just obsessed with all things fantasy. And so I made this tabletop role-playing game called Adventure Quest. And if any of you are familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, you'll know what that is. It's kind of like a bootleg Dungeons & Dragons. You know, my primary reason for making it is I just thought it would be a cool idea. I was like, oh, this would be a really fun game to play. But I also realized kind of halfway into my making the game is that it's kind of like a bootleg Dungeons & Dragons. And at the time, we weren't allowed to play Dungeons & Dragons. So I was like kind of worried about that. I was like, but you know, I was kind of hopeful. I was like, maybe if I can get my dad into it, then, you know.
You won't have anything to judge me about.
Yeah. You know, then we can keep playing the game. So that's kind of what the game was and why I made it.
And of course, I was too slow to know that was going on. Yeah. So one evening, Peter came up to me and Andrew and said, hey, I'd like to play this game with you, right? And part of the game was that we had to build our character sheets, like draw our characters, and then we had to pick the weapons that we were going to use and kind of the special powers that we would get and stuff like that. And when I initially started playing, it was cool to play something with the boys, but I thought it was kind of quaint, and I was a little bit apprehensive because I was like, I wonder what if this is going to be fun. But one of the things that I actually never saw coming at all when I first started playing the game and developing my character and everything, one of them was I had no clue about how good of a storyteller my son was. And then another thing that I never saw coming is that just in the course of playing the game, we would actually trip on these meanings that were so intense that they would literally generate conversations between us for years. And I would say that there are a number of vignettes and meanings that we stumbled on just in the course of playing the story that were so intense that they would easily outstrip the impact of any sermon illustration that I've ever heard in my life. And they would illuminate the biblical story in ways that I just never even seen or heard a sermon illustration illuminate a whole sweep of passages. How many years do you think we've been talking about what we're going to be talking about?
I mean, since we started playing, 8 or 9 years or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, like you said, generate some interesting conversations. However, I will say, at the time for me, it was probably more annoying than anything because we'd just be playing the game, and he did end up enjoying it. So we had a lot of fun times that weren't, didn't turn into huge conversations. But for me, I was like, why? He would pause the game and he'd go whoa, he'd start freaking out about this crazy thing that just happened. And for me, I'm 13 or 14. I'm like, Dad, just play the game.
Shut up and play the game.
Yeah. And so it was And then also on another thing growing up is that anytime we'd watch a movie, he would dig into all the meanings in the movie, and I'd be like, just let me watch a movie, just let me escape. So it was frustrating for a long time. It's probably only until recently, when our relationship has gotten better and stuff like that, and I've realized that I'm actually turning into like a copy of my dad in a lot of ways, that I'm like, oh, I see what he was so interested about. And so we've been able to like revisit that together in ways that have been a lot of fun. So, but this story revolves around one particular adventure that they were on, and they had just come out of the Dark Forest. I know, it's the most original name ever. And they got attacked by some wraiths while they were on horseback. And the wraiths were flying along beside them and attacking them with, weapons. And when they went to attack back, their weapons passed straight through the wraiths. And, me being the storyteller and stuff like that, I know that there are you have to have certain pieces of equipment to be able to defeat the wraiths and stuff like that. But Dad took a completely different, he had a completely different perspective on it. And yeah, you want to unpack that a bit?
Yeah. So, after we got the beat down by these wraiths, and then we turned around to basically take our turn on the wraiths and our weapons passed through, I was like, my mind was boggled. Like I was like, hang out, hold on, time out. Like we've got to stop, because this is like so crazy that like I need to stop and make sense of this, like to double check that the world isn't like fundamentally broken or something. Because one of the things that really spooked me about this encounter with the race was that I actually existed in a world in which there were these kind of malevolent creatures whose own physical presence in the world and weapons were capable of actually having a tangible physical effect on me. But then when it was time for me to actually have an effect on them, they had the capacity to simply just evaporate or disappear, if you will, so that my weapons had no effect on them. And that really spooked me, because I was like, wait a second, if these are the bad guys and like they're evil and malevolent and everything like that, and they can actually pound on me, they have a kind of physicality, and their weapons have this kind of physicality where they can pound on me, but I myself can't do anything to them. That means that I'm actually adventuring or trying to get somewhere in a world in which malevolence will actually reign at the end of the day. And that just like completely spooked me.
Yeah. So I don't remember the specifics of what happened with that session, but I think that was actually the last session we ever played. I don't think we got further than that. Not because of that instance necessarily, but because life just happened and stuff like that. But yeah. So do you want to kind of unpack some of the meanings that you've been able to extract from that wraith story, and kind of how it relates more to real life a little bit?
Yeah. So after like discussing like the initial shock of like what was going on with the race, another thing that I realized just thinking about it, because I was like, when it initially bugged me, it caught me so hard that I was like, I've still got to think about this, because I think there's actually more here. Like there's more that I like need to put my finger on, because there's just more meanings that are running around than I'm even seeing about the malevolence problem. Like if you encounter a creature that has a kind of malevolent or evil intentions towards you, and he can actually affect you and wound you or even kill you, and you can't do anything to him, then how is it not, the case that like malevolence and evil reigns in this world, and there's just really nothing we can do about that? Like even beyond that issue, I was like, there's actually still more here that I need to think about, and I need to work through. And one of the things that I realized was that the more that I thought about this, was that there was a real dignity and substance to having a willingness to actually become visible. That is, to desire to have an effect on the world, and then have an effect on the world through your actions that you yourself are willing to subject yourself to. And the more I thought about this, I started to realize, oh, this is actually one of the central questions about justice itself. Because if you think about like the different kinds of justice that exist, say like punitive justice, one of the things that punitive justice is actually getting at when say a culture has punitive justice as a part of its life together, one of the things that's actually going on is that the people who are involved in administering the law are actually demanding that the unjust person actually live in the world that they themselves have made for others, or to bear burdens themselves that they've actually placed on others, or to restore uh, uh, to a person the things that they've actually stolen from them.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to go into an example of punitive justice and kind of unwrap that a little bit about how, the prescription kind of says, hey, you should live in the world that you've created for others through your actions?
So one of the examples of punitive justice and perhaps restorative justice in contemporary life and experience is if somebody steals something valuable from you, they're actually taking the good reward that you got for your labor and giving you nothing back in return. And so if you live in a culture that's committed to justice, one of the things that they'll actually do is they'll make the thief restore back to you what they took from you, and then even pay a fine. Sometimes that can happen as well. But the basic idea is that in encountering justice, the thief actually has to experience in his own experience what he actually forced you to experience, which is losing the good reward for your labor. And one of the ideas behind that that can be teased out is there are some people that have this idea that punitive justice is kind of inherently perverse or vindictive, and I actually don't think that that's the case. I think it's actually an invitation to compassion, because like in the case of the thief, when he actually has to live in the same world that he actually made you live in, one of the things that it allows the thief to do who's being punished is to know by way of his own experience, rather than by like an abstract idea, what it is to actually live in the world that he's forced you yourself to actually live in. And if the thief is actually learning what justice is seeking to teach him, he'll go, dude, it's really scummy to actually lose the good reward for your labor, or that you got from your labor. And I need to stop that because I hate doing that. And I literally just did that same thing to this other person. And so if a person, there's kind of this element, I think, of genuine justice. It's not merely only punitive in its aim, but it's actually restorative in its aim. And that it's seeking to get the person who's broken the law or violated what's good to actually experience in their own experience what it was like to lose what they forced someone else to lose.
Yeah, for sure. And so there's a sense in going back to, what you were saying about it's a desirable trait to want to live in the world that you've made for others. One thing we've talked about is like, it's almost like that is the acid test for your own actions in the world is my actions are going to have consequences, and am I okay with living under those consequences myself, or am I going to force it onto other people and run away from the consequences? And if your case is the latter, then your actions probably aren't good,
Yeah, they're also like an example of becoming invisible.
Yeah.
Because what like you mentioned how like justice is kind of like an acid test that determines whether or not the way that you've acted in the world is actually good. If what you've done by acting in the world is indeed good, then there's not only a willingness to act in the world, but there's a willingness and a sense in which you're prepared to live in the world that you've made for others to live in.
Yeah. And so throughout this, one thing to keep in mind throughout the rest of this episode is we'll use the terms becoming visible or becoming invisible interchangeably, or not for one another, but when we say becoming visible, what we mean is a general willingness to live in a world that you've created for others. And when we say becoming invisible, we're referring to, you create a world for others that you hide and you run from the consequences. And in the case of the wraith story, at first it was, very metaphorical because the wraiths were literally going invisible when he would try to attack them. But it, like we're kind of unpacking here, it turned into this thing that was so much more broad than simply, oh, they just went invisible when I tried to attack them, but there's so many meanings buried underneath that stuff that was able to help us draw, some comparisons to real life. And the Abraham and Isaac story is we'll go into here shortly.
Yeah. What are some, speaking of becoming invisible, we actually stumbled on some example, like concrete examples in our own lives, like even years after the original story, that were like, oh my gosh, those people are becoming visible. You want to talk?
Yeah.
Or they're actually becoming invisible.
Yeah.
Do you want to share a couple of those stories?
Yeah, totally. And this is where, as I got older and I started realizing why my dad was freaking out so much about this story, that I'm sure the stories that we're going to share you'll resonate with a lot, because I think this idea is at the center of a lot of the issues that we deal with as a culture, in terms of the outrage and the anger and the hurt that we feel towards politicians and the wealthy and stuff like that. Is there's this a sense, in a way, in which their actions and their decisions and the influence that Wall Street has on the lawmaking and the decisions that the lawmakers make, those have effects on our lives, but there's this sense that they aren't willing to subject themselves to the effects that their decisions have. So like one personal example that was really like kind of earth shattering to me was a few years ago in 2021, when the whole GameStop thing was going on. I had quite a bit of money in GameStop at the time, and there was it was one of the craziest events in like recent modern history. It was just, there was this very real sense that we had made the right play and we were finally going to stick it to the hedge funds, because we were under this assumption that if we invested in this free market, that you're told all the time, this is a fair market, this is a free market, and we made the right call and the right prediction, that we would be rewarded for that call, right? And then basically, if you're not familiar, Robinhood, as well as several or many other firms, prevented users from buying GameStop, and that basically took all the buying pressure that was propping the stock up out, just cleaned the legs out from the stock, and it just cratered. I'm pretty sure it was January 28th. Pre-market, it was like $531 a share, and all indicators were that it was going to go just absolutely parabolic. You have Thomas Petterfy, the CEO of Interactive Brokers, saying on the news later, he was like, yeah, if we let that thing run, then all the clearinghouses were done, like literally bankrupt. Like the biggest transfer of wealth that, we've ever seen in our lifetime, right? They disabled the buy button, essentially, is what people refer to it. And they cleaned all that buying pressure out. And it was this weird instance where it's like, you're so sure that you understand how the world works, and it all gets inverted like that fast on its head. And at the heart of it, there's this thing where it's like, what about when we make bad bets, when the little guy makes a bad bet, then people get absolutely obliterated by it and stuff like that. But and you'll see all the time all over Reddit, people will post their margin calls and stuff like that when their bets go sideways, and Robinhood's knocking at their door and freezing their account and all this stuff until they pay their margin, right? But these huge hedge funds and stuff like that, when they make the wrong bet and they're way in over their eyes in debt and stuff like that, they get saved from the consequences of that bad bet, right?
Yeah, so that was an example in which you're basically investing and working in a context, assuming that the types of world that you lived in and the type of world that they lived in were actually the same world, but they were radically different.
Yeah.
Because when it was time for them to actually get margin called, they just had ways of becoming invisible.
Yep.
That is, of ducking the weapon, if you will, of a margin call. So that it had no effect on them. Another
example I'm sure you're familiar with that we've talked about is the song "Fortunate Son" by Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Yeah.
And the chorus goes, "I ain't no fortunate son, I ain't no senator's son," or something like that.
It ain't me. It ain't me.
Yeah. And they're outraged about the fact that the politicians are sending the common people's sons to war over war that they claim is just and justly motivated, but they won't send their own sons out to fight the war. They're going to send all these other people's sons, but they're not going to be responsible for the consequences of that decision.
Yeah, that is. I actually want to create a world in which I have the liberty and freedom to send your sons to die.
Yeah.
But I don't want to experience that same loss myself by sending my own son.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another example of people kind of becoming invisible, so to speak, is the mortgage crisis and the housing collapse in 2008. And that whole thing essentially was caused by banks. It was a three-way deal. So you had the banks who were issuing loans to anyone, regardless of their credit rating or their income or anything like that. Loans that, there's no way that they could repay these loans. And then you had basically the banks would take these loans and bundle them into an investment vehicle called a mortgage-backed security. And basically, investors in mortgage-backed securities would get paid dividends based on the interest payments on these loans. Now, what would happen is the credit agencies were in cahoots with the banks basically, and they would give these mortgage-backed securities, AAA rating, like up there with federal government bonds in terms of safety. And so all these people, including, you had people taking people's retirement money and investing it in mortgage-backed securities under the pretense that they were, AAA certified up there with government bonds in terms of safety as an investment vehicle, when in reality the loans holding up the mortgage-backed securities were all just complete garbage. And most of those loans were adjustable rate loans. So what happened is when the interest rates, went up, then they raised the interest rates on all of their borrowers, the banks did, and tons of people just defaulted on their loans because they couldn't make the payments. They literally couldn't. And so then you had the housing crisis where housing prices collapsed and there was a massive oversupply of homes and all that stuff. And after that happened, after countless people lost their jobs and their homes and all this stuff, the losses incurred, right? The famous bailouts that happened in 2008, the losses that those banks incurred got pushed onto the taxpayer. And, there were these huge bailouts and the taxpayer had to pay the consequences for what these guys on Wall Street did. And there's this dynamic of privatization of gains and socialization of losses, right? So they use our money with the loans and stuff like that, reap these massive gains on mortgage-backed securities, and then when they get in way over their head, they shove all the losses off onto us. But, obviously the average person never saw, a penny of that money from the mortgage-backed securities. So, and then, famously only one person, I believe, went to jail from that fiasco. And it wasn't even like a high ranking member of the banks. I'm not positive on this, but I think it was like a lower level banker at Goldman Sachs, but I'm not positive on that. But to my knowledge, only one person went to jail for that. For the just catastrophic amounts of fraud and deception and all this stuff that ruined so many people's lives. So that's like one prime example, I would say, of becoming invisible. I'm sure, I'm sure while we were talking, you guys thought of, your own examples, because every single day, if you spend any amount of time on social media, every other headline could be an example of somebody becoming invisible and, screwing someone else over and then running from their consequences, right? So we can think of examples like that all day long, right? Where it's like, these people have done us wrong. But what starts to get really scary is when you start to ask the question, what does justice look like? Like, for example, let's say that these banks were going to make amends essentially for what they had done and be brought to justice. What are some things?
Yeah, if we want to become visible, what would that look like?
Yeah. So they say they wanted to do something like that. What would be a good start?
They'd have a lot of money to pay for sure.
Yeah.
Or to restore back to the people who lost their homes and everything like that.
Yeah.
But then you had tons of people actually commit suicide because of what happened with the mortgage crisis and loss of their home and their future and their retirement and everything like that.
Mm-hmm. And you have there's no way to possibly estimate the monetary damage that was done to the people that lost their homes and their family line down the line. The kids that grew up in destabilized homes because of what happened with the housing crisis. Yeah, just family stress, like the kind of environment that puts on everyone in the family, as a result of that kind of stuff. I mean, just the damages add up so fast, it's incomprehensible. And if somehow you could pay back the monetary value of what was lost there, how do you solve the problem of the excess suicides? Like you can't bring those people back to life. And paying money back to the families who lost people because of that doesn't even begin to repay what was lost.
Yeah. Nor if you put, say, 5,000 people on the hook for their malfeasance during just the housing crisis itself, um, that's a monetary bill that's so staggering that they'd have enough to pay each person back $5 or something
Yeah.
if they work their whole lives, maybe.
Yeah, so it starts getting pretty scary when you start to take stuff like that seriously, and you go, what would justice look like, and what are the consequences of our actions? It starts to get really scary when you turn that same lens inward, and you think about, all the things that you've done carelessly, and all that kind of stuff that had, untold amounts of damage to people because of your own behavior. Yeah.
Yeah, like I could tell a story from my own life, like of getting into debt, like way deeper than I could ever repay. I remember, maybe I was in third grade or something like that. I was walking around in the neighborhood where I lived with my brother, and we were walking around, and we happened to come across this kid who walked with a real noticeable limp, and and because I was an arrogant little devil when I was a kid, um, I told this kid, I said, "Hey, you walk around like you have a metal bar shoved up your ass," and I can't remember the expression like on his face, but like I remember thinking about that afterwards and going, you know, like here I am, a person who came into the world like with my body working right. Um, and I encounter someone who has, say, a physical disability, and I actually mock him about that. And there's literally nothing he can do um, to actually fix what I've criticized him over. Um, uh, that had to make him flinch for, uh, I mean, the immediate moment that I said it, but then even a long time after that. I mean, um, uh, even if he wanted to fix the criticism that I'd made, how would he actually do that? And so I'd essentially, I had actually turned himself on himself and against himself by pointing out a problem with himself that he could do nothing to do to resolve. Um, and if I thought, okay, um, I actually want to become visible and restore what I took from this guy. Um, how do you restore the lost trust of people that he grappled with after that comment that I made to him? There's no way that I could actually restore that. I would love to actually meet the guy again and actually give him a decent apology. I would love that. But that was an example in my own life in which I took something from someone, like their sense of safety and trust, and never restored what I actually took from him.
Yeah. And I can think of examples where when I did go to public school, it was really hard for me. And oftentimes, I got bullied and picked on a lot and stuff like that. And oftentimes I would find myself in situations where I could put someone else down to make myself look cooler or better or whatever, in hopes to, get a little bit of a purchase with the people that I wanted to find favor with or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I have no way of knowing or repaying the damage that I did to those people, multiple people, multiple times. How did that affect their confidence down the road? What opportunities did they miss out on because of that lack of confidence? On and on and on. And I mean, I can think of multiple examples. I'm sure you can too in your own life, where it's like and you don't even have to go anywhere scary, quote unquote scary. Like you don't have to, you don't even have to go anywhere that seems like absolutely horrendous to just, if you sit and think about it, you're like, oh my gosh, what have I done? If you actually think about what my consequence or the consequence of my actions are, a really scary place to be. So there's a quote that I heard that my dad told me about a long time ago that really stuck with me on this issue of consequences and stuff like that, and how if you want to take consequences seriously, you just become paralyzed with inaction, because how can you, like, what can you do? What can you possibly hope to do without affecting somebody in a way that you could literally, because you're a mortal being, never hope to repay? So this quote is Douglas Murray. It's from a book written by Douglas Murray, and he's quoting,
Hannah Arendt, I think. I think it might be in The Strange Death of Europe too, as well. Possibly that might be the book.
Okay. Oh yeah, so in his book, when he refers to this lecture that Hannah Arendt, is that how you say?
I think so.
When he's referring to her lecture, he says, but towards the close of her lecture, Arendt reflected on some of the consequences of being active in the world. Every human being's life is able to be told as a story because it has a beginning and an end. But the actions between those two fixed points, what we do when we are acting in the world, have consequences that are unbounded and limitless. The frailty and unreliability of human affairs means that we are constantly acting in a web of relationships, in which every action touches off not only a reaction, but a chain reaction. This means that every process is the cause of unpredictable new processes. A single word or deed could change everything. As a consequence, says Arendt, we can never really know what we are doing. What makes the frailty and unreliability of human action worse is the fact that, as Arendt says, though we know what we are doing when we are acting, we have no possibility ever to undo what we have done. Action processes are not only unpredictable, but they are also irreversible. There is no author or maker who can undo what he has done if he does not like it, or when the consequences prove disastrous. Just as the only tool to protect against unpredictability is some ability to make and keep promises, so Arendt says only one tool exists to ameliorate the irreversibility of our actions, and that is the faculty of forgiving. These two things necessarily go together, the ability to bind together through promises and the ability to stay bound through forgiveness. Of the latter, Arendt writes, without being forgiven, released from the consequences of what we have done, our capacity to act would, as it were, be confined to one single deed from which we could never recover. We'd remain the victim of its consequences forever, not unlike the sorcerer's apprentice who lacked the magic formula to break the spell. It's from The Strange Death of Europe by Douglas Murray. With that kind of ominous thought, hanging in the air, we're now going to dive into the Abraham and Isaac story. We're going to kind of put a pin in that, and we're going to start to dig into how the Abraham and Isaac story can actually speak to that. But one of the first things that we want to do before we dive into that, we're going to read the passage here in a second, but we want to first just plainly and openly lay out all the buggy, bizarre seeming problems with the text that come to mind if you're reading it and taking it seriously, right? Like, what the frick is going on here? And we want to just lay out all those things and be really honest and open about them. So I think you have a list there if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that happened to me at work some time ago was that a coworker came up to me, and I have a great relationship with my coworkers, and most of them know that I'm a Christian, have been a pastor too as well. But we've got this openness in our relationship where they're free to come up and say to me something that they think is weird about the Bible. So one time I was at work and I was just kind of going around work, doing my daily tasks at work. And I had this friend and coworker come up to me. And he said this to me just out of the blue. He goes, "What kind of God would command a father to disembowel his son?" And when he said that, I instantly knew, he's talking about the Abraham Isaac story in Genesis 22.
It's a fair question.
Yeah, no kidding. And I realized when he asked me this, like I was trying to mentally shift gears from what I was doing at work to actually fielding his question and taking it, it seriously. But I was like, oh man, like, what do you say to a question like that? Like, well, technically God didn't tell Abraham to disembowel his son. He told him to offer him up as a burnt offering. If I told him that, it's like, that wasn't going to fly. And so one of the things that I asked him, I said, well, do you actually know what happened with Isaac? And he said, no. And I said, well, he actually left the mountain with his father. He actually didn't die. And he didn't know that. And then I also said, in Israel's subsequent history, they actually did sacrifice their children and burn them to death. And And he seemed kind of disturbed about that. And God actually kind of upended them as a nation because of that.
And one thing I just want to insert there real
Yeah.
quick. And not that just because Isaac came down from the mountain doesn't solve the initial question of what the heck is God doing, asking him in the first place.
Yeah.
But he was just filling him in on more of the story. But continue.
That's exactly right. And so even though I pointed out that God actually resisted Israel because they actually did kill their children in the future, I think probably what he could have said in response was, well, why in the world did he command Abraham to do something at the founding of their nation that he later ended up undoing them as a nation for, right? So that's one of the initial tensions with this story. The next tension I've already alluded to. Why is it that God would actually command the founder of a nation to do something that when subsequent generations actually followed through with and actually did, he ends up exiling them as a nation? For example, in Deuteronomy 12 verses 29 to 31, it says that they're not supposed to worship God like the nations do, who cause their children to pass through the fire. In Jeremiah 32:35, God condemns Judah, and he says this: "They have built the high places of Baal in the valley of the son of Hinnom to offer up their sons and daughters to Molech. Though I did not command them, nor did it enter into my mind that they should do this abomination to cause Judah to sin." In Ezekiel 16 and 20, God actually condemns Israel for causing their children to pass through the fire. So, and that seems kind of odd. Why, if God was so disturbed or irate about that is killing their children or offering them up as burnt offerings, why in the world does he tell the founder of the nation of Israel to actually do that? Another question that arises is, what's the point of giving Abraham this command? And then when he obeys or goes to obey, you actually tell him to stop. I mean, everybody's glad that Abraham stopped, but if you were going to get him to stop or tell him to stop, why did you tell him to start in the first place? Another tension that exists in the story is that if a person wants to imply that it's somehow appropriate for God to command Abraham to do such a thing, why would this actually not portray God as a kind of peevish, furious, or irrationally mean God to his own people? Another one is, why would you actually regard someone else as insane for allegedly receiving this command while excusing Abraham from the same allegation of insanity? And then perhaps a final one is, are there any buffers in the story or in its surrounding context that would actually preclude sane people everywhere from attempting a similar insanity? For example, there's been people in history who've actually attempted to mimic this, but weren't as generous with their own children as Abraham was, right? Another example that I just learned recently in Mormonism, one of the justifications that Joseph Smith used for supporting his polygamy was that the people who were being put through the ordeal, offering up someone to Joseph Smith for a spouse, was that they were actually participating in the same type of sacrificial experience that Abraham was. So that's perhaps a final kink. If you thought that Abraham was actually obeying something that God actually told him to do, how is it that you actually buffer the meanings that seem to be flowing out of the story so that you're not producing a bunch of maniacs or people who are actually using the story to justify things that perhaps God never intended? So some additional tensions exist even in the Christian community. For example, sometimes when the chapter on Abraham is preached on, Abraham's obedience will function as kind of a parable of how we're supposed to offer things of value to God. And while we might be happy that there's, say, maybe been an application that suggests a little bit of downgrade to the intensity of the obedience. One of the things that's slightly odd is that sometimes those types of application can seem to paper over the gravity and the specific shape of what God actually asked Abraham to do or commanded Abraham to do. I mean, he didn't actually command Abraham to go throw a pouch of gold coins over the side of a cliff as an offering or a sacrifice to God to offer something of value to God. He actually commanded him to offer up his own son as a burnt offering, right? Another kind of meaning that's been attributed to this passage is by Jordan Peterson. One of the things I appreciate about Jordan Peterson, I think that he's right about, and I'm thankful for his kind of charitable interaction with the word, is that he comes at the word with this conviction that there's something of value or use for life that can be derived from the word. And in his view or unpacking of the Abraham story, he also sees it as kind of a parable or a story of the importance of sacrifice. And he draws that out by explaining how in the life of a civilization, you have to be willing to make sacrifices today for the sake of receiving a deeper or better blessing in the future. And that idea is fundamental to civilization itself. And so while I'm thankful for, say, the charity that Jordan Peterson often has when he's interacting with biblical passages, even ones that are as difficult as the one that we're taking on today, I actually don't think that the meaning that he's ascribed to it is even one of the primary meanings that actually are bound up with the text.
Awesome. So, and I'm sure there's things that you guys are thinking about that we're not even thinking about, that, you ask what the heck is going on when you read that passage. And so I think now what we're going to do is we're going to actually read the passage itself, just so that we all, for those of you who haven't heard it, that we know, exactly what the text says, that we're all on the same page and we have a refresh of the passage. And then we're going to jump in and kind of talk about some of the things that we've talked about over time that have helped us make sense of the story. It's gonna be cool.
Yeah, like what are some of the major puzzle pieces that actually have to lock in place before the story actually makes sense?
Yeah, and why is this relevant to us today? All this time later. So it's gonna be really good. And let's read the passage. This is Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer them there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went, both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his thorns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now after these things it was told to Abraham, "Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Uz
something like that.
His firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. Bethuel favored Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Reumah, bore Teba, Gaham, Tahash, and Maacah. Just real quick before we launch into it, I never noticed before that when Abraham is talking to his young men before they go up the mountain, he says, "Me and the boy will return," basically.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. I never noticed that before.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's the passage. It's a doozy for sure. So, do you want to go into kind of some of the
let's
things we
just
started going through?
Start looking at the puzzle pieces, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that I do when I encounter a passage that really throws me for a loop and I'm super disoriented is I'll start asking some really basic questions or just making really basic observations that are really clear and just start ruminating on them. And before we even actually come to the story of Abraham and Isaac, one of the first puzzle pieces to actually get in place is that there is no magical island of meaning where the sovereign or whoever or whatever's thought to be sovereign in the world won't mortally oppose you. So, for example, one of the most common, groups that just love to bring up the issue of Genesis 22 and the story of Abraham and Isaac is atheists, right? And Richard Dawkins, both loves and hates this passage at the same time. Hates it because he thinks it's disgusting, but then also loves it in a way because he can use it as a cudgel to clap Christians with over how insane their God is and kind of what a moral monster he is. But one of the things to keep in mind, and I've never heard an atheist actually mention this or bring this up or attend to it, is there isn't really some kind of magical island of meaning that anyone exists in, irrespective of what your worldview is, in which whoever or whatever is sovereign in the world isn't actually going to mortally oppose you. So in the atheist worldview, the thing that exercises the most sovereignty in the world is an impersonal matter and energy and motion. And while it's awesome to live life and to be alive, there's going to be a day for every one of us where this impersonal matter and energy and motion is going to exercise its sovereignty to actually mortally oppose us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and 2 things I want to say real quick. One is that, in the beginning we talked about trying to uncover some of these shared meanings that we have, and this is one big one, is that, like you said, regardless of who you are, regardless of your worldview, we all die, and we all get, opposed by whoever is top dog, so to speak.
Yeah, or whatever.
Yeah, whatever, whoever, whatever, for sure. And also the other thing is, you're talking about whenever you come across a passage in the Bible, one thing you do is you kind of lay out first what's transparently obvious, to help you make sense of it. And that's a technique that I think could be used not only when you're trying to examine the word, but also when you're trying to examine any idea from any viewpoint that kind of throws you for a loop, regardless of what your background is oftentimes there's all kinds of things, unsaid things hiding underneath any given, proclamation or statement or whatever. And if you can kind of unpack what those things are that are transparently obvious, it can help give you a better place to work from to make sense of it. So anyway, continue.
Absolutely. So the second piece that I observed when I was trying to work through this story is that it's really clear that at a minimum, in the command itself that God gives to Abraham, God is asserting his right to mortally oppose Isaac. And insofar as Isaac might be an embodiment of Abraham and Sarah, he's asserting the right to mortally oppose them as well. And so that's a great second piece to bring in, is that at a bare minimum, one of the essential features of the story is that God is actually asserting his own right in the very giving of the command to mortally oppose Isaac. Then after that, the third piece is, this isn't actually the first time in the Bible, say, a mortal threat from God has been asserted that actually seems to be weird or irrational when it's asserted. The very first time that it happens, something like this happens in the Bible, is where God tells Adam and Eve earlier on in Genesis, all the trees of the garden that are in the garden, you're free to eat from them, but don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because in the day that you do, you'll surely die.
Yeah, and that's when I still didn't make sense of for the longest time. I'm like, yes, like I get it. I'm like holding this intention, but at the same time, I'm like, why? It's a fruit tree.
That's exactly right. It's like, why isn't the penalty for eating from? It's not really clear. Like when you're reading the story for the first time, or even the first couple times, why is it that there seems to be a capital offense kind of meted out for eating the fruit from the tree? I mean, why isn't the penalty if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, if you eat the fruit, say, God will pick off a few of the fruits and just clap you in the head with them? Like maybe a cosmic snowball fight will ensue, between God and Adam and Eve if they eat from the tree, and he'll frickin' peg them in the back of the head with whatever kind of fruit that happens to be if they eat. It actually isn't that way in the story. He actually says, in the day that you eat of that, you'll surely die. And that seems to be every bit as much of a curveball or a shocker as God's command in Genesis 22. But it's important to notice this, the first one, because once you unlock the first one, the logic of the first one, it'll start the snowball of meanings down the hill that'll actually gather up the Abraham story and make sense of it as well.
Yeah.
But the first step in that journey is to say, okay, one, at a minimum, God is actually implying that he has a right to ask such a thing. And then number two, which was the third piece. It's
not the first time.
Yeah, this isn't actually the first time in the biblical story or the Bible where God has asserted something or given somebody a warning that there's like a mortal danger up ahead that seems on its face to be really irrational.
Yeah. So in light of that, what is going on? Again, we talk about meanings all the time. We say it over and over. And this is true, again, not just of the Bible, but of anything in your life. When you hear, see, or read something, there's all kinds of meanings that are nested underneath and going on. And so yeah, what can we learn from what's going on in the fall story?
Absolutely. So one of the things that the descriptors that you actually get of the serpent in Genesis 3 is that the serpent was more crafty than any of the creatures that God had made. And he is absolutely crafty. And my basic thesis of God's interaction with Adam and Eve and the serpent over the tree is that the prohibition exists because God isn't just merely telling them not to pick a particular kind of magical fruit and eat it. He's not just telling them to stay away, but what he wants them to do is to run away from adopting a disposition of soul that's actually aimed squarely at the murder of God.
So how do you see that in the text? That by buying into that lie, you're actually have a murderous disposition towards God.
Yeah, you're basically adopting a disposition that's aimed squarely at the murder of God. Yeah. So what's really interesting is the hints of this hostility to God emerge very faintly in the serpent's temptation, and then every time that this theme is actually revisited, it'll actually intensify until it expresses itself in the attempted murder of someone who's made in the image of God and then represents the saving presence of God, and then ultimately God himself. But let's start back with the serpent's temptation. One of the things that the serpent says to Eve is, he says, has God really said that you shouldn't do this? And she's like, yeah, he said that you shouldn't eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you surely die. And he goes, oh no, well, God knows that when you eat of it, you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And so what's really interesting about that last phrase, God knows that when you eat of it, you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. One of the things that he's alleging, there's actually a number of things that he's alleging, but one of the things that you'll notice about knowledge is that knowledge is one of the main things that you actually have to possess as a precondition for confident action in the world, right? So that when you act in the world, and you can just think about this in your own life, the point at which you act with confidence in the world is the point at which you believe that you actually have knowledge, right?
And inversely, if you think about situations where you're unconfident, it's almost always because of a lack of knowledge, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things that the serpent is alleging is that there's something that you actually need that you don't have, that you can only get if you actually function as a source of moral authority yourself in your own life, and you decide for yourself what's right, and then you go take and you eat of this fruit. And what's really interesting is part of what's crazy about his allegation is that crisis of confidence, because it's an allegation that's actually made of God, who in the story has made everything. That crisis of confidence can't actually be resolved unless you get rid of the source of that crisis of confidence, right? And so in when they reach out, or when Eve reaches out and she takes the fruit and then she eats and then she gives it to Adam, they're actually buying the allegation that's actually baked in to the serpent's temptation, which is basically a rejection of the goodness of God, but also that they're buying into the allegation that I can't act with confidence in the world unless I function as a source of moral authority in my life and decide for myself what's right.
And they don't even have to be aware, like consciously aware, that this is what they're doing for the disposition of heart to still be a valid one.
Yeah.
I mean, in the same way that, all the time when we act and do stupid bonehead things, we have no idea what that says about our true self and our true, heart and stuff like that. And obviously it's a lifelong journey of discovering, more about yourself and rooting out all the all the malevolence wherever it lies and stuff like that. So anyway, yeah. Continue.
Yeah. So as the story continues, there's actually two more times that this theme is of the eating from the tree is actually revisited, or you'll see hints of it. And the second time you actually see this, the issue of the tree being revisited is when after Adam and Eve eat and they realize that they were naked and they experience shame and they run from God. God goes actually looking for them. And he's given what actually follows, he's remarkably kind and gentle with them and simply asks them, hey, who told you that you were naked? Did you actually eat from the tree that I told you not to eat from, right? And of course, everybody blame shifts on everybody else all the way down to the serpent, right? But there's something super fascinating about what Adam says as he kind of rolls out his excuse to God. And he said, his excuse actually travels in two directions. And he says, well, the woman that you gave to me, she gave to me to eat and I ate. So that's his answer to the question of why he's actually hiding in shame and why he is bothered about his own nakedness, right? And what's super interesting about that allegation is he's actually arguing in contending in his excuse that God is kind of like a divine sadist. That what's interesting about Adam is that and the story of creation is that the first recorded words that a human being speaks in the Bible are words that Adam actually gives that are actually a celebratory poem that Adam breaks out with joy and expresses at the sight of being given his wife Eve. And after he revolts with his wife and starts making excuses, that joy that he had in the presence of his wife and in the God who gave it actually gets inverted and turned on its head. And so one of the things that's super interesting about his Adam's allegation is that he's really alleging that you gave me this person or this wife to me as a gift, but she's actually functioned like a fishhook that's designed to just rip my throat out and lead me into shame and despair and everything like that. And his allegation is also an allegation about intimacy, because one of the most intimate bonds that Adam has in the whole world is the relationship or the intimate bond that he actually has with his wife. But for Adam, if his allegation is actually true of God and Eve, then it means that at the very most intimate part of Adam's life, that he's being fish hooked by a malevolent God to turn what he thinks is intimacy into a curse, right? And that's again a kind of allegation. If it's a kind of allegation that's an absolute disaster, because if his allegation is actually true, and you're actually experiencing sadism at the most intimate area of your life, then there is no lesser intimacy that Adam can experience in all the world that is safe. If the deepest intimacy that Adam can experience is in danger because it's saturated with the malevolence of a God whose goodness he rejects, then no lesser intimacy that he experiences is safe. And the only way for Adam to actually resolve the allegation is to actually remove the cause for that sadism, which is actually to just take God out himself. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, this is one of the reasons too why a theme emerges later in Scripture, in which, say, Jesus got a question once from someone, and he said, "What is the greatest commandment?" And Jesus said, "Well, to love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commands turn all the law and the prophets." And the reason that these two commands kind of undergird or sit underneath all the law and the prophets is because those commands are actually an inversion of the original foolishness that Adam gave into or embraced when he actually indicted God. It's an indictment of his closest neighbor, which was his wife, and then a shot at God.
Yeah. And so what you can kind of see start to unfold here is the moral opposition that we see at the very beginning from God that seems kind of, cattywampus, is actually deeply logical, because if these things are true and, fixing these problems that Adam and Eve are bellyaching about requires the removal of God, then what is a logical God to do but to remove the people who are, mortally opposing him, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, if the thesis can be borne out that the disposition of soul that's adopted in the first rebellion isn't simply a matter of being a bad fruit picker, but actually adopting a disposition of soul that's actually aimed at the murder of God, then one of the questions that you have to actually immediately ask is, if that's actually the case, then does God actually have the right to mortally oppose someone else before they actually mortally oppose him, right? And so the third little vignette that you'll actually see that kind of makes sense of the tree, and it's one of the events that actually really clarify this idea that there's a wee bit more baked into the first rebellion than simply being a bad fruit picker. There's a story of Cain and Abel that actually shows up in Genesis 4. So in Genesis 4, one of the things that you see is that the chapter basically begins with Cain and Abel bringing sacrifices to God. Cain, he brings a sacrifice from the fruit of the ground because he was a worker of the ground. And then Abel brings a sacrifice of an animal along with its fat portions. It was immensely more valuable as an offering than the one that Abel brought than the one that Cain brought. And the two different offerings actually kind of mirror in a way the way that they both see God, right? So Abel brings offerings that are valuable because he values God. Cain brings his fruit as an offering because he doesn't value God as deeply as his brother Abel does, right? So we'll pause right there for just a second.
So we'll revisit that a little bit, because you'll start to notice how many similarities actually show up in between all these two stories. One other thing I want to point out with the fall story is, in the Abraham story, you have this thing where God has this proclamation of judgment on Abraham and Isaac, but he shows mercy and he spares Isaac. And you see the same thing in the fall story, because God made the pronouncement before they took of the fruit and they ate of it, but he's remarkably tender and merciful to them when he finds them in the garden, and he shows them mercy. And you'll see that same mercy in the Cain and Abel story that we'll get into later. But you want to add on to that?
Yeah, another example of his mercy is that in the verse that they kind of call it the proto-euangelion, which means the first gospel. One of the things that God tells Eve as he's interacting with her after their revolt is that her seed will actually bruise the head of the serpent. And it's
Mhm.
super cool because God is basically saying the very one who is responsible for being deceived by the serpent is actually going to produce an offspring that will actually bruise the very snake
Yeah.
that tumbled
Yeah.
them into the mess in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so in terms of Cain killing Abel, one of the things that you'll see in Cain's attitude as God engages with him is you see the same contempt for one's closest neighbor and God that Adam had shown a chapter before. It
Yeah.
simply intensified.
Yeah, and the neighbor isn't merely a neighbor, it's also an image bearer of God.
That's exactly right.
Because, man was made in God's image and stuff like that. So it's not merely contempt for, this is in God's image, right? So
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. So another theme, like as you mentioned, that emerges in the word is that the contempt or the disdain or the evil that's actually done to someone who bears God's image isn't just a sin against the image bearer themselves. It's actually a shot at God himself.
yeah.
Right?
And this is one thing that, and this is the really hard thing about being raised in the church is I would hear that all the time is like, all sin is, when you sin against that person or whatever and yourself and God. And, I was always like, man, that's so extreme. Like, why does everything have to be extrapolated that way? But again, it's really hard when you're raised in the church and you just get kind of numb to this language and you don't ask these questions when this language is just thrown around 24/7 all the time. And so I think that's why it's so important to go through this kind of thing and like really internalize it for yourself. But yeah, do you want to move on to the next puzzle
the next
piece?
puzzle. Yeah. So to summarize the one that we actually just worked through is the puzzle piece that we actually just worked through was that this isn't the first time that you see God say mortally opposing someone, and that mortal opposition seems irrational or weird, right? And we're actually going to revisit this one and reiterate it and show how it works out in just a moment. But the fourth piece is that in the word and in life itself, the gravity of an act isn't clearly seen just by looking at the immediate effects of the act, but watching how the effects of the act actually travel through time. So with this in mind, one of the misnomers that actually takes place when people read the account of the fall is, and I do this all the time, I'll describe the event or the tragedy of what had happened. I'll call it the fall as though there's one sin that's going on, but there's actually not one sin that's going on. There's actually a whole cluster of sins that are going on.
And you'll hear the event get referred to in a very reductionistic way all the time because it's like, well, they just ate an apple. But like you said, you can't judge the consequences of an act merely based on what happened. And so while that is kind of in my opinion, not a great way to criticize the text, it's also thinking about my personal life. How many times have you done something stupid and you try to downplay it. And you're like, well, I just did this, right? But you can't assess the gravity of the consequences of an action simply based on what happened or,
it's immediate effects.
Yeah, it's immediate effects.
Yeah, but you actually have to pay attention to the way that the act itself or the ideal that was sitting behind the act actually travels through time and its effects that travel through time. So what's interesting about this idea is that in the fall, the story of the account of the fall in Genesis 3, there are actually at least three kind of master sins, if you will, that are bound up in the first act.
And this is another puzzle piece. But by the way, we're moving on to the next one.
This was the fourth piece.
Oh, no.
That's fine. So one of the things that you'll find as you meditate on the story of the fall in Genesis chapter 3 is there's at least three sins that are actually sitting underneath the first sin. And those three sins are these, and pay attention to this. This is super fascinating. The first one is deception. The second one is denied responsibility, and the third one is cynicism about the possibility of unity. And one of the things that's worth touching on really quick is, like, how did I start to zero in on the issue of, say, the first one, deception? And one of the things that I noticed is when I was reading the call of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, where God calls Abraham and he says, hey, leave the land that you're living in right now and go into the land that I'll tell you. The very next vignette story that happens after Abraham answers the call from God is a story in which Abraham is deceiving someone else. And then what's really crazy is you'll watch subsequent stories to Genesis 12 be narrated about Abraham and his descendants. And if you just watch the story of them getting in trouble and just doing things to cause absolute chaos, you'll find at the center of those stories someone deceiving someone else. And this happens in the life of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph's sons.
Yeah.
They all engage in a kind of deception that's like, as the effects travel through time, it's profoundly destabilizing.
Yeah, and in the case of in Genesis 12, the story you're referring to, if you're not familiar, basically Abraham and his wife are traveling to Egypt.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And he basically tells her, hey, tell them that you're my sister, because he's basically afraid that if he says, she's my wife, that they're going to kill him ostensibly or take her in some manner. And so they deceive Pharaoh. And that causes all kinds of problems there. But that's where the deception shows up.
Yeah. And so you'll see this. And when I realized that deception is running throughout Abraham's entire family line, beginning with Abraham, I was like, where did deception first show up in the book? In Abraham's own story? And it's like, oh my gosh, it's actually the serpent that's actually the first deceiver in the Bible. And I was like, well, how do I account for that? Because God has called Abraham to this remarkable task of being a blessing to the nations, and at some level addressing in a profound and a deep way the problems that had actually spun out into human experience as a result of the first rebellion. One of the ways that I actually account for that is that that Abraham is actually snake bitten. That there are things in his own experience in his own life that he articulates and brings into the world that are actually mimicking and participating in some of the behavior that the arch enemy of the whole biblical story is actually engaged in. And yet somehow God is still faithful to him and invites him in his generosity to actually participate in his purposes. So deception was the first was kind of the first thing I saw that oh, dude, this theme is ricocheting all over the place in Genesis. It begins with chapter 3, and then it starts ricocheting through Abraham's family line, goes all the way to the end of the book.
Yeah. Do you want to unpack the denied responsibility and the cynicism about the possibility?
Yeah, absolutely. So deception and then denied responsibility. You see this denied responsibility right in Genesis chapter 3. It's plain as day. I alluded to it earlier on when God comes strolling to Adam and Eve after they've ran away and are hiding in the garden. And he asks them, what have you done? Literally every single person between Adam and Eve, they literally just blame shift onto the person right next down to him, right? So Adam actually blame shifts onto his wife Eve, and then Eve blame shifts onto the serpent. And it's well, the serpent, told me to eat of the tree or whatever. So it's just nobody's taking responsibility. He's asking a simple question, but nobody's taking responsibility, and they're just buck shifting. And then this actually shows up again in Genesis 4 in the account where Cain murders Abel, because God comes again quizzing someone who's essentially eaten from the tree, right?
Yeah.
Adopted that same disposition. And he asks him like, hey, what's going on?
Yeah.
And you know what?
Cain says, where's your brother?
Yeah. Cain's like, or God's like, where's your brother? He asks this to Cain, and Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? And that's an example of deception and denied responsibility, because it's true that Cain is his brother's keeper, but he's actually denying it. It's a rhetorical question. He's asking about God. Am I my brother's keeper? But it's also an example of him denying responsibility because he is his brother's keeper. And then, of course, every one of these people that are involved in this little toxic and nuclear daisy chain of a revolt
are actually also engaging not just in deception, denied responsibility, but also cynicism about the possibility of unity. Because the reason that Satan's temptation actually gets sway with Adam and Eve or sounds plausible is the moment at which they're cynical about the possibility of experiencing a unity with God. And the reason they're cynical about the possibility of unity with God, not just the serpent, but Adam and Eve when they swallow his lie, is because it's profoundly hard to desire unity with a person that you don't even believe is good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And what's super interesting is if you watch this little toxic cocktail of three sins actually travel through the biblical story, you'll see deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity. And if you put your finger in those stories and you follow them through time, you will actually hit a story in which someone who is made in the image of God, someone who represents the saving presence of God, or God himself, is they actually attempt to murder someone who's made in the image of God, someone who represents the saving presence of God, or somebody, or even God himself, right?
Yep.
So you see that you see that going on with Cain and Abel in the Cain and Abel story.
Because Abel is favored with God, and Cain murders him, and
Cain again is cynical about the possibility of unity, not only with his own brother but with God himself. That's why his offering is so limp and pathetic, right? One of the things that's remarkable about the kind of the immediate context of Genesis 22 is that in Genesis 20, Abraham again is involved in the same kind of deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity that was hinted at in Genesis chapter 12. He actually does it again. He lies again about his wife, saying, "Oh, this gal's my sister." And then the guy asks, why is it when he discovers that in Genesis 20 that Sarah is actually Abraham's wife, he's like, "Why did you do this thing and bring all this, like these freaking hideous plagues on my household?" And you know what Abraham does? He essentially, he just blame shifts onto the guy. He said, "Well, I said this because I thought there was no fear of God in this place." And he's essentially denying responsibility for his own deception. And he's basically saying to the king or the pharaoh that he actually deceived. Well, it's your fault that I deceived you. And I was like, no, it's not.
Yeah, and the whole thing, the whole reason that Abraham lies to Pharaoh in the first place is because he's cynical that he can have unity, him and his family can have unity with Pharaoh.
That's exactly right. And it'll be shattered essentially by Pharaoh's own desire to kill Abraham and take his wife. And he fantastically underestimates how much fear of God this pagan has, that he hasn't even encountered. He's cynical before he even meets him. And then what's a kicker is that in Genesis 26, Isaac actually does the same thing his dad did over the same issue. He was going down to Gerar, the land called Gerar or something, and the king of Gerar. He was afraid that the king of Gerar would actually kill him to take his wife. And the same thing happened. It's deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity. It's like ricocheting around in their family.
Yeah. And like you were saying, it always manifests itself as the attempted murder of somebody who represents the saving presence of God, is made in the image of God, or there was one other one.
Or God himself.
Yeah, or God himself.
Yeah. So
let's go into more of these just quickly. Like, what about the David story? What about the David story?
We'll catch David in a minute.
Okay.
One of the places this clearly shows up in the story of Genesis and Abraham's own immediate family is in the story of Joseph and his brothers. So in Genesis chapter 37, you have this story of Joseph's betrayal, where his dad kind of loves Joseph and kind of has a special affection for him that he doesn't necessarily have for his other sons, and it causes like that favoritism actually causes a real rift between Joseph and his brothers. Well, Joseph has these dreams in Genesis 37 that's essentially, I had dreams that my brothers and my mom and dad were actually going to bow down to me. He has a couple of these dreams, and it's just like there was already like animosity between the two of them, and like the dreams that Joseph had, that he was stupid enough to tell his brothers, just like was pouring gas on the fire, right? And so Joseph's dad actually sends Joseph one day, hey, go down to check on your brothers and see how they're doing. And there's this kind of hint, like there's this kind of hint in his, just the instructions themselves, that I'm going to send my admirable son and, go check on the weasels and see how they're doing, right? Well, when Joseph comes up, they say, hey, let's kill this dreamer and see what happens to his dream. They're actually going to they throw Joseph in a pit, and they're actually going to kill him. And then their brother actually, one of Joseph's brothers says, hey, let's not kill him. And he actually is trying to dissuade them from killing Joseph, but they end up actually selling their brother Joseph as a slave to some Midianite traders, who then take Joseph down to Egypt and sell him as a slave into the land of Egypt. And so they're, of course, knowing, hey, okay, we're eventually going to have to go back home, right? And so, like, what are we going to tell dad? And what they, within the span of like a verse or two, that you literally have the trio of deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility expressing itself in someone who represents the saving presence of God, or who not only is made in the image of God, but actually represents the saving presence of God, which is Joseph himself, right? And what they do is they say, hey, let's take his coat, tear it to pieces, and then we'll dip his coat in this blood, and then we'll bring it back to dad and see what he says, basically, right? And so then they bring the coat back to dad, and they're like, hey, we just found this coat. Well, is this Joseph's? Is this the coat of our brother? And then, of course, he sees it and he goes, oh my gosh, a wild beast has torn my son. He thinks he's dead, and he comes apart.
Yeah. And one thing I want to say, even if you don't agree with some of the other meanings that we, kind of pull out of these stories and stuff like that, I know one thing that I took away from this that I think is a valuable thing to be aware of. The denied responsibility personally hits home pretty hard for me, because I just over time I've really come to have this perception of like, you have two different types of people in a sense, and there's the people who take responsibility for their actions and kind of the way their life is, and they're able to make progress, and they're generally pleasant to be around and stuff like that. They're not constantly like blame shifting everything onto other people. It's like kind of victim versus, I take responsibility. And then, on the flip side, you have people who are always playing the victim, always blame shifting and saying the problems in my life aren't my fault. They're somebody else's fault. And, regardless of what you think about the other things in the text here, I think one thing for me that I've thought about a lot is, I always, anytime I hear myself, blame shifting onto somebody else for any reason, I've tried to be a lot more thoughtful, because it's scary when you realize that these three things are like ping-ponging around in the Bible and stuff like that, and they cause all kinds of problems.
Yeah, havoc.
Whenever I see it in myself, I'm like, it makes me really nervous. But not only in like not only in a way of like, oh, I do something malicious and then I don't take responsibility for it. It's also like, oh, I'm not where I want to be. I'm going to blame somebody else for it. And I had this written on my whiteboard. It is all your fault. And I don't mean that literally, but it's a constant reminder to me, like, before I'm going to bellyache and blame somebody else for something that I'm upset about, whatever it is, I'm not where I want to be for X reason. I have that reminder is like, hey, are you doing what you can be doing to make the best out of the situation? And I find this at play all the time, like in my relationship with my wife. I'm like, she'll do something and I'm like, or she'll react to something I did, and my first thought is, oh, she's being so unreasonable and I'm so frustrated. And then, I sit there and I think about it, and I'm like, am I really doing the best thing that I could do here? And oftentimes it's not even like I'm doing something pernicious, but there's a state of affairs that I'm not really happy with, but I'm also like, oh, I haven't really been being proactive and doing proactive things to make that state of affairs better. Or, and then if I'm honest with myself, I can think of, 5, 10, 15 things that I could do right now to make things better, but it's hard and it takes a lot of work and honest introspection. So anyway, all that to say that, even if you don't agree with some of the other meanings we take out of this, I would really encourage you to
pay attention to that trio.
Yeah, pay attention to that trio, and yeah,
because it ricochets everywhere.
It does
throughout all these biblical stories, important biblical stories, and then right up into contemporary life.
Yeah, and don't underestimate, the danger of blame shifting and it's something that I've really tried to internalize over the past year, and I'm seeing just so much more growth in like my relationships and my work and stuff like that when I take personal responsibility for things before I start trying to blame people for the way things are. And that's not to say that I'm perfect at it. I still, all the time I'm constantly like, man, I'm belly aching about somebody else's crap when I have stuff that I could be doing, so anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And even before we go on too fast, you can even like a contemporary example where this trio is just absolutely wreaking havoc is just look at the war in Ukraine through the prism of these three like radioactive sins: deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity. And this is a direct shot at Vladimir Putin, because this three trio went unchecked. And if you just watch how the war developed, deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity.
Yeah, and you have so many layers of each one of those things going on in the thing, in the Russia's war on Ukraine. So anyway, yeah,
and so if you another place that you can actually see this this deadly trio going on of deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity is in Jesus's trial with Pilate. Right? Because part of what I'm alleging here, as we're looking at kind of the background story of the Abraham account, is that the revolt that's actually adopted in the first rebellion and travels down through subsequent generations doesn't just hit Adam and Eve. It starts rolling through their own first children, through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, his children. You see this, people getting owned by this this trio, but it actually you see this trio happening with Pontius Pilate too as well. So, for example, in it's Matthew 27 towards the end, verse 24, Pilate actually says, "Hey, I don't find any fault in this man," and yet he's going to condemn him anyway, which is an act of deception because it implies that he's worthy. Jesus is worthy to die when he's actually not. And then what does he do after he basically announces that he's going to condemn?
He washes
this guy?
his hands of him.
That's exactly right. He washes his hands, which is a denied responsibility. And then, of course, cynicism about the possibility of unity. And Jesus's exchange with Pontius Pilate, he talked to him about like, I've come to bear witness of the truth, right? And he engages Pilate, but Pilate is absolutely cynical about the possibility of unity with the person of Jesus. And instead of letting an innocent man go free, he actually condemns him to die. Unbeknownst to Pilate, he's actually sending the God-man to the gallows, essentially to the cross to be crucified, because he's actually getting owned by the same thing that everybody else upstream of him had got owned by: deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity.
And there's so many things there that we could unpack, but I think that the things that stand out to me is it lends further kind of credence to the idea that Adam and Eve's original sin it's actually aimed at the murder of God. And as it travels through time, it manifests itself in the murder of the God-man, Jesus Christ himself. And so, in the way that the Bible tells a story, it lends credence to that idea that you're talking about, that sin is aimed at the murder of God. And so God, a logical God would mortally oppose somebody who is doing that. But also, it lends credence to the belief that Jesus is the Son of God in a way.
That's right.
Yeah. But anyway, let's keep going.
Yeah. So the fifth piece is that because this sin that the Bible talks about doesn't just affect what we do, it actually affects who we are, so that we actually reproduce who we are. The effects of that sin actually travel intragenerationally, and you'll see this all throughout the story of the Bible, where there's a real difficulty, and when somebody gets comes to know God in a real and a powerful way, and their lives is transformed, one of the things that will often happen is, it's really hard to carry that momentum forward. So you'll see this in the book of Judges. It's all about this cycle going on where there's a return to God and back to the covenant. And then subsequent generations, they'll just slide away, and they'll go off into idolatry and just running and fleeing, and then God will oppose them. He'll resist them, and then they'll return. And there's just these cycles of running away and returning, right? And so that actually is relevant to the the story of Abraham and Isaac, because both of them are actually in the same plight. Both of them have actually been snake bitten. So that's the fifth piece. It's piece of the puzzle, that it's not the problem of sin as it's described in the Bible is not just something that's purely external. It's something that's internal, that passes intragenerationally.
Yeah.
So then the sixth piece, you want to go into the sixth piece?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So one of the reasons that for the sixth piece, one of the reasons that the events of Genesis 22 actually belong among the founding events of the nation of Israel is because it models for the nation of Israel the paradoxical conviction that it's possible to become fully visible by presenting oneself to God as a subject of justice and be safe at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what way early on we had asked, well, why is it that God tells Abraham to do something, that is go offer up, he implies that he has the right to mortally oppose him, right? And that Abraham is supposed to participate in this opposition. But then he tells him to stop. Why is it that you say go and then no? And one of the reasons why that this is so important for the story of Abraham and the founding of the nation is by Abraham's obedience. And this is Isaac's obedience too as well. I mean, he doesn't run away and say, get lost, Dad.
Yeah, you'll notice
right?
in the text, that there's no indication that Isaac is resisting or,
Yeah, and another thing that's stunning on that account too is there's no indication in the text that Isaac turns from God. He actually enters into the same vocation that God had given Abraham, and he participates in the worship of God even after this event. It's absolutely stunning. But one of the things that's just remarkable is that they as hard as it is to become visible and to present oneself as the subject of justice, Abraham and Isaac actually do this. But in Abraham's obedience to God and Isaac's as well, they're essentially both presenting themselves as subjects of justice and admitting in the very fact of their obedience that God has the right to mortally oppose them. And you could pause here and just go, well, that's stupid. I don't want to inhabit or deal with this kind of story anyway. And like we mentioned in the very first puzzle piece, you can't extract yourself from this problem. Because if you say, hey, look, I just want to pitch Yahweh over the boat because he's a sadist and convoluted for mortally opposing anyone, you still have a sovereign that you're going to have to face that actually will mortally oppose you. So that the inevitability of being mortally opposed is a given, irrespective of what tradition that you want to inhabit. The $1 million question is there anyone in all the world that will actually render a different verdict than one towards humanity that is one than a verdict of mortal opposition, if you will?
Yeah.
And part of what God is doing when he says, don't touch the lad, is because he's acknowledging Abraham's obedience, that they've presented themselves, if you will, as subjects of justice. And God's like, I want mercy instead. And so the reason that God actually stays Abraham's hand and says, don't, is because when you present yourself as a subject of justice in the presence of God, God will opt for mercy or opt to offer you mercy. And so what ends up happening is instead of sacrificing Isaac, there's a ram that's caught, just happens to be caught in a thicket, and Abraham grabs that ram and actually sacrifices the ram in Isaac's place, and Isaac is essentially liberated from the verdict of death and gets to go free, while the ram is actually sacrificed in his place.
Yeah. And I don't know if you touch on this in a later puzzle piece, but one thing that we've talked about that really hits home for me is, like, can you imagine if our leaders had the same disposition of heart, where they realize that somebody is watching them and that they're subject to that? Do you think you would have, the issues that you have on Wall Street and the politicians and the corruption and stuff like that, if they knew that they were subjects of justice and that, someone was watching them and holding them accountable? Like, do you think we would have the problems that we have today? Which is why it's so, one of the reasons, in my opinion, it's so remarkable that it's happening at the founding event of their nation, like you said, is because God wants them to start the nation on this bedrock,
Yeah, Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
and
exactly
submit
right.
themselves.
That essentially has like this introspective capacity in which they're not beginning their life as a nation by going, oh, all the problems that exist in the world are out there. It's everybody else that's the convoluted snakes and pieces of trash, right?
Yeah.
It's like there's a profound sense in the acts of obedience in which they're saying God has the right to actually mortally oppose us, and it's such a unique expression of introspection and honesty about the fact and the gravity of their own plight that I think it's unparalleled in national history. I mean, we even have this own problem in American national history. It's not unique to America, but everyone that has founding figures in the lives of their nation often grapple with the problem of making their founders more than they actually were.
Yeah.
And what's crazy is in the biblical story, it's that tendency to elevate the founders to like this level of perfection that they just don't have. It's backwards in Israel's story. They don't begin with frickin' beating their, drumming their chest. They actually begin by saying God actually has the right to mortally oppose even the very person that I love the most in life.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think one thing that's interesting about this for me growing up in the church is I was always like, man, why does it appear like, why did God choose Israel specifically? And, I had a bunch of questions like that. Like, is Israel favored and God, holds everyone else to a higher standard than he does Israel and kind of lets Israel get away with this and that. But after going through this story and taking it seriously, you're like, oh no, like God, he's not, giving Israel a free pass. Like he's saying, he's demanding that they become visible and all the implications that go along with that. So it's
and then at the outset,
that's a big demand.
Absolutely. And then at the outset of their lives together saying, oh, by the way, I'm willing to mortally oppose you, right? Because the plight that you're in and that humanity is in, you actually share together. You're not exempt from the fact of that plight or the tragedy.
You're not different from
plight.
These other nations.
Yeah. And as you'll find out in the rest of Israel's story, one of the things that happens is this mortal opposition doesn't just happen once with Abraham and Isaac. It also happens with Moses, because Moses is on his way back to Egypt to deliver Egypt. I remember telling you and Andrew this story, like reading it when we were little kids. And I'm like, oh yeah, Moses went back to Egypt and then an angel of the Lord met him to kill him in the road. And when I said that, I was just like reading it like the normal Christian way of reading the story. And Peter and Andrew's mouths just dropped open. They're like,
well, yeah, because Moses is like, to us, he's like the main figure of the story, and God's like, you're doing all these cool things. I'm going to do all these cool things through Moses. And it's like that fast, he sends an angel to kill him, and we're like, what the frick is going on?
Yeah, absolutely. And then you'll also see this with Joshua too, as well, where he meets the angel of the Lord right before they're going to go into Canaan. And then Joshua, when he sees the angel, he's like, hey, are you for us or against us? And the response that he gets is just stunning in its depth, because it literally, the response actually travels as a form of wisdom throughout subsequent history. And he says, what's super interesting when Joshua says, are you for us or against us? He says, neither. But I'm the commander of the army of the Lord of the hosts. And what's really fascinating about that response is, it's like, well, hold on just a second. Joshua is actually about ready to do exactly what you told him and the nation to do. That is, go up in the land of Canaan and dispossess the Canaanites. And they're doing exactly what you told him to do. And then when he says, oh, are you for us or against us? He goes, neither. And it's like, whoa, what's up with that? And it's like, well, two battles from that very encounter that Joshua had with the angel of the Lord, they're actually participating in the same type of rebellion and revolt that they're ostensibly judging, and God frickin' roasts them in battle.
Yeah. And that when I heard about that passage too, it was another thing that just like blew my mind about. I always had the sense, or one of the reasons that I kind of circled out of church and stuff like that. Overall, I think it was more of just a fatigue with the environment, feeling like I wasn't doing something that was like true to what I believed. But anyway, I guess one of the things that always was kind of disconnected with me about the Bible is it was like I felt like life was really messy and had a lot of gray areas. And my understanding of the Bible at the time was like everything is super black and white. But when I heard that verse, I was like, it like blew my mind. I was like, even on the Bible's own terms, it doesn't say that life is black and white and it's, these people are right and these people are wrong. That passage where he says neither. And I mean, imagine you're in Joshua's shoes, dude. That'd be freaky. But this idea that, like God is working through Israel, but he's not saying, you are right and exalted and everyone else is
just scum.
Just scum. There's this tension of like, they can do, they can, work as part of God's story and work his intentions, but they're also,
subject to being resisted by God in profoundly painful ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it essentially lays waste to this kind of chest thumping arrogance that God is on my side. I mean, how many times have you heard that throughout history of somebody saying, chest beating and saying God is on my side? And it's like, dude, you need to be humbled, chap. It's like, yeah, God's he's on that one, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of also in terms of you mentioning just a little bit ago that it's profoundly a significant idea to have a sense that God is actually aware of what you're doing, is paying attention to what you're doing. Douglas Murray actually brings this up in I think it's Pangburn lecture series in a discussion that he's having, I believe, with Sam Harris. And then there's another moderator. But the question of who's responsible for the atrocities of the 20th century, is it atheism? And of course, Sam Harris, this is a subject that Sam Harris and Douglas Murray are debating on about. And Sam Harris has a thought about this question obviously very seriously, and so he rolls out all these lists of reasons why atheism shouldn't be held responsible for the atrocities of the 20th century. And then one of the things that Douglas Murray says, it's so fascinating because it's introspective and it's generous observation of him to make, because he's actually an atheist, and he's making this statement as an atheist. He said, but one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that in Nazi Germany, no one believed that anyone was watching them. And he's making a really astute observation that one of the things that you have to say about what was going on is none of the Germans had a sense that anyone in Douglas's Murray, in the context of what he was saying, no one, including God, was actually watching them. And that's actually a loss, not a gain, right?
Yeah, for sure. Before we move on to the seventh puzzle piece, let's summarize the sixth one again.
Yeah. So the sixth puzzle piece is essentially that the events of Genesis 22 actually belong in the founding events of their nation, because the chapter models for the nation a paradoxical conviction that it's possible to become fully visible by presenting oneself to God as a subject of justice and be safe at the same time.
Yeah. Good stuff. All right, let's move on to the seventh puzzle piece.
Okay, so in the seventh puzzle piece, it goes something like this. In their obedience, Abraham and Isaac are actually upending or inverting some of the central follies that had been bound up with Adam and Eve's sin and kind of the major kinds of foolishness that had bedeviled the human race up to that point, and even still do, really. So, for example, one of the first examples of this inversion is that their obedience actually takes seriously God's right to mortally oppose them before they seem to have a clear sense of why, before Adam and Eve actually did, or when Adam and Eve actually didn't, right? So one of the things that happened in the temptation of Adam and Eve is that when God warned them, he said, the day that you eat of the fruit, you surely die. They didn't take that seriously. They're just like, nah, this will be okay, right? They didn't take it seriously. Where Abraham and Isaac, in their obedience, they actually do so before they have an exhaustive sense of why. And it's absolutely remarkable because, like, I don't actually think that Abraham at this time actually grasped the full sense or weight of the tragedy of deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity and how it works out through time.
Oh, yeah.
He can't possibly know that,
no.
Right? He doesn't know, for example, what's going to happen with his own, say, grandsons, where they're going to attempt to murder another one of his grandsons, Joseph, right? He doesn't know any of that. And yet before he even knows how fully this trio will actually work out through time, he obeys anyway and concedes God's right to actually mortally oppose him and his son. Then another aspect of this is their obedience inverts the tendency to deny responsibility and blame shift on everyone else, as though the world's dislocation and tragic plight is the fault of someone else. We had touched on this earlier a little bit. You'll actually see this in the pre-flood narrative, where it says that it says in the pre-flood narrative, kind of summarizing what was going on before the flood, that it was a time in which every intent of man's heart was only evil continually.
Pretty bleak.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also says that the earth was full of violence. And one of the things that you'll find in the word about the violence that God actually condemns, which that was one of the vignettes or season in which God was condemning the violence, is that one of the features of violence that should be condemned is the way in which that violence is actually preceded by a blame shifting on the other person for the tragedy that's befallen the community. You see this with Cain and Abel. You see this with Lamech, who actually murders someone for insulting him. There's a blame shifting onto the other person as being the source of the problem, and then trying to solve that blame shifting by an act of violence. So Abraham and Isaac's obedience actually inverts this tendency to deny responsibility, and they actually take it instead of denying it or shirking it or shoving it off onto someone else. And then the next little piece of this is that insofar as Abraham's obedience is grounded in a conviction that God is able to or will raise his son from the dead, his obedience reasserts the goodness of God, even on the heels of a comprehensively catastrophic verdict about the human plight and his role in that plight. Right? You had actually alluded to this earlier on when that you saw when you just read this chapter. You're like, oh, there's something I noticed in there that I didn't notice before. And it was
that when he's talking to his young men, he says, we're going to go up and worship and we'll return to you.
That's exactly
knowing
right.
full well that God has asked him to sacrifice his son up there on the mountain. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, how did he hold both of those ideas in his head without his head blowing up? And And the way that he did was he was convicted or had a conviction that God was able to actually raise his son from the dead, even if he obeyed. And that conviction was a reassertion of the goodness of God, a conviction that actually was being undermined by the serpent in the garden and then all the way down.
Yeah, another inversion.
Yeah. So another feature of this inversion is that the substance of what Abraham and Isaac are doing isn't articulated by subsequent generations through, say, an identical mimicry, but by becoming visible to God and one another through the sacrifice of rams, goats, or lambs, right? So one of the issues that we had brought up in our early introduction is like, well, how do you deal with like situations in life where people attempt to mimic what's going on and they go crazy, and like, how do you guard against that? And it's like, well, in the story itself, Abraham doesn't sacrifice Isaac. So that automatically precludes, it's insane, everybody else who goes, hey, let me just kill my kid, okay? Out. The story itself doesn't even articulate that, right? But the way in which Israel and subsequent generations actually participated in those meanings isn't by sacrificing their own children. It's actually by sacrificing a ram, a goat, or a lamb. And the sacrifice would actually end up taking their place. It was a way of articulating the gravity of sin, while at the same time God was actually conveying his mercy and saying, and essentially saying to the worshiper, I'll actually take a lamb as a sacrifice instead of you yourself, right? But there was always, when Israel was grappling with these realities, there was always a sense, or always should have been a sense, that God has the right to mortally oppose me, but because of his mercy, he's not. And he's providing a way in which I can go free and receive his mercy. Another feature of this inversion is that their obedience inverts one of the radioactive centers of sin that are presupposed in every act of evil or sin. And that is one of the, as I just meditate on like what sin is and its features. And one of the reasons, by the way, that I do this is because I don't want to be suckered by the deceitfulness of my own sin, right? But one of the ways,
bitten.
Yeah, that's right. Again, right? For the 50th time.
Yeah, 50,000.
Yeah. So if you meditate on what sin and evil is in its essence and nature, one of the things that you'll, or one of the lies that you'll find that's going on in the premeditation of it, or even the committing of it, is, oh, this won't be so bad. This won't be so bad. And this is like a super big one for me, or obvious one for me, because I spent, say, about 20 years in jails doing open forums and helping inmates work through the biblical story and their questions about the biblical story. And it was a really awesome time in my life. I wish I could do it again. And Lord willing, I will be able to. But one of the consistent features that I'd encounter as I was in jail is that guys would sometimes open up and talk about their stories. And oftentimes one of the unspoken lies that was sitting at the calamities, underneath the calamities that they were experiencing, and the loss and the grief that they were experiencing right at that moment, was a lie that said, oh, my sin won't be that bad, right? So for example, for some, it could be, hey, I'm going to get drunk tonight and it won't be too bad. It'll be okay.
I'll make it home.
Yeah, I'll make it home. Yeah, and I've literally met two men who lost their families in a drunk driving wreck where they walked away alive, but their family was dead.
Yeah. And this one in particular is one of the big reasons, because when I circled out of the church, another thing I want to make clear is, we know and we acknowledge that the church in particular the evangelical church in America have just done some things that are extremely hurtful and appalling and stuff like that. But a lot of my journey in like circling out and circling back in, I'm still not going to church regularly, and part of that is because I still feel a disconnect when I'm there, and also I don't think I've resolved some of the things there. But with that being said, this issue, as I was exploring, kind of circling out, circling back in, because when I was circling out, I started reading some more like progressive Christian literature, and and this is a question that I could never really get answered from progressive Christian literature and other literature from other viewpoints that I would read, is a lot of the thinking that would undergird kind of their proposed ideas kind of nested on that, what's the big deal? Which is kind of the same thing as it won't be so bad. Yeah. And a lot of things I could find just weren't taking seriously the gravity of sin. And I wasn't necessarily calling it that per se, but more so, I can't find anything that's really taking seriously the gravity of evil, and that it is a big deal, and it's not something that you can just like gloss over. And so that was something that I couldn't really find a good answer for, and other things that I would look into didn't really sit well with me, is because I was like, man, like evil is a big deal and it's important to take it seriously. And I think it's one of the reasons that I've come to really enjoy the Old Testament and stuff like that, and stories like this. Is it's like one of the, like we were talking about earlier in the video, where like the consequences that a single human can accrue for themselves is just like staggering. It's frightening. But the Bible is like one of the only things I've found where it's like it takes evil seriously, but it also gives room for hope. Because if you take evil seriously and there's no hope, then it's just crushing, like, beyond everything. So anyway, and if you go too far one way where you have too much grace and not the taking evil seriously, then it doesn't have legs.
Yeah, you'll get destabilized. Yeah. And then on the other hand too, if you focus too obsessively on the nature of sin without encountering the grace and the mercy of God, you also get destabilized that way too as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so as we talk about like the seriousness of sin and try to tease out its entailments in our own lives and even in these stories, it's not for the purpose of simply loading people with guilt.
Yeah.
It's for the purpose of intensifying and magnifying the mercy of God.
Absolutely.
Because like where Paul, this was something that Paul said that was just so awesome. He said, where grace abounded, sin did much more abound. And we find that in this story. And we've like kind of went through a bunch of these central stories, and we've noticed, oh my gosh, God has like tons of mercy for these people, like for Cain, right? Abel doesn't get to go away free at the end of the story. He's in the ground and he's dead.
Yeah.
Right? But Cain goes free.
Yeah.
Right? The people of Egypt who were enslaving the people of Israel for 400 years, they were receiving the very mercies and graces that they were depriving the children of Israel of, right? And God was pleased to have mercy on them anyway and show them grace upon grace upon grace for generation after generation after generation, right?
Yeah. And I guess one more thing I'll add, and then we can go on the next thing is I also, and I, I totally acknowledge that, I have been skeptical of the word and stuff like that and of Christianity. But I never, I know that I was raised with a bias in a way, and I have inherent biases and all that stuff that I'm not even aware of. But I think one thing I noticed, and I think that a lot of people can relate to, is just this general, at least in the secular world, is this general sense of hopelessness, because it's like, what do our actions even mean? Because it's like you, on one side, you're bombarded with, it's not that bad. What you do isn't that big of a deal, which has implications both for the bad things that we do and the good things. Because if the bad things that we do don't have any gravity, then the good things don't either. But also at the same time, you're constantly, like with cancel culture and all that stuff, you're bombarded with, if you step out of line of the social norm, you're going to get absolutely tarred and feathered.
Yeah.
And so there's this like very paralyzing and hopeless feeling that I sense, and I know a lot of people sense, is like, what do our actions even mean? And can we even act confidently without fear of being crushed? And, what does it mean to act well in the world? So, and I think this stuff that we're talking about brings a lot of, sheds a lot of light onto that stuff. And it's another reason why I think it's so relevant. So.
Yeah. And even though the story is like super intense, like the story of Abraham and Isaac, it's like, this is one of these passages where God's like breaking out the can of, mean, nasty God, right? There's his one of the reasons that we actually think he's being nasty is because nobody to a person has ever spotted that trio in my own experience, like the trio of deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity, and then followed that through time to the attempted murder of someone who's made an image of God, someone who represents the saving presence of God or God himself.
Yeah.
Right. And if you actually take that into account, you go, oh my gosh,
it is a big deal.
It is a big deal.
Yeah.
Because the mess that God is seeking to rescue the human race from and humanity from is from a disposition of soul that's essentially aimed at the murder of God. Right.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. And so
on to the next inversion.
Yeah. Before we get to the next inversion, I would say about the inmates that I've encountered that have been so kind to share their stories. I don't think, even though that I've heard these stories of sorrow and we've explored together some of the lies that have actually sat underneath the losses that they experience, there's probably not a single person that I've encountered that has articulated the story of loss and we've grieved together about that, who wouldn't also say, dude, if you gave me the opportunity to rewind my life and to intensify the gravity of sin in a way that I could see it before I just went off the rails and just everything went absolutely haywire, I would literally let you cut all the fingers off my hand and all my toes or whatever, or just delimb me. If you would have just given me the capacity to perceive the gravity of sin in a deeper way than I had before.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, I've met people who've train wrecked their own families, who after narrating the train wreck said, dude, the experience is like having vultures like pick my guts out.
Yeah.
Right. And so when I talk about the gravity of sin, or you see this in the chapter of Abraham, it's not for the sake of just crushing you down or saying, you're so bad and blah, 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 because I actually share in Abraham's plight and the plight of the rest of human race. Right.
Yeah.
But it's for the purpose of discovering the gravity and the intensity of the mercy of God, because I experience it every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
really good.
Yeah.
Really, really good.
So the next one is with respect to Abraham and Isaac's obedience, is that their obedience displays a rare and radical honesty about their own role in the human plight, by implying that God is justified in mortally opposing them. Again, we've covered that, so we can move past that one.
Yeah, definitely.
Pretty quick. The next aspect of their obedience is that their obedience and the story that it's actually nested in underscores the intensity of God's mercy in such a way that it allows us to face the most intense criticisms and stand at the same time, right? Because part of working, I think one of the reasons why I personally, and this is like a personal confession, one of the reasons why I couldn't spot what was going on in the Abraham Isaac story was because I was bluffing about the nature of my own sin. But
Yeah.
then the moment I asked the question, under what conditions would God possibly be justified in mortally opposing
Yeah.
Abraham or Isaac? The very process of taking that journey wasn't just an indictment of Abraham or Isaac or all the people that went before them. It was an indictment of myself
Yeah.
and the fact of
Yeah,
my own
yeah.
sin and the way it travels through time and everything like that. It was like,
For sure.
holy cow.
And because like, when the default way of approaching the text is this is blown out of proportion, and the inherent meaning in there is it's not that bad.
That's right.
Yeah. You're bluffing about your personal, culpability for sure. I can relate to that.
Absolutely. And so while it's been, and I think maybe, and some of the reason why I think I took a different stance towards the text than just simply continuing to bluff isn't really because I didn't start down a different way of reading the text or reading the backstory because I wanted goodness. I took the journey because I had seen so much devastation from people lying about the gravity of sin.
Yeah.
And I had to just watch it and say, wait, I need to pay attention to this and think maybe there might be something to what God is actually implying, that he does have the right to mortally oppose them.
Yeah.
And maybe I need to take that seriously, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's been a journey it's been a journey into intensity, but also a journey into the sense of the mercy and the grace of God.
Yeah.
And it's a journey that actually obligates me to pass on to others the very same mercy and grace that I myself have received, right? Mm-hmm. And I actually use that as kind of a way of calibrating my relationship to the text, and my reading of the text is, am I becoming a person who loves mercy as a result of doing this deep dive and trying to be honest about the gravity of my own sin?
Yeah.
Right? Am I a person who loves mercy? So this is kind of cool. Their obedience, that is the obedience of Abraham and Isaac, liberates a nation and its citizens from the lie that you can make a great nation while simultaneously ignoring the radioactive center of evil and sin, or bluffing about how good you really are.
Yeah.
Right? We'll get into how big that is later.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as we mentioned before, God didn't just threaten to mortally oppose Abraham or Isaac. He actually threatened to mortally oppose Moses, Joshua, and Israel herself.
Yeah.
There's again, to reiterate it, there's this radical introspective capacity that Israel has as they tell their own history that I haven't seen, like this honesty that I haven't seen anywhere else.
Yeah.
Certainly haven't seen it in my own nation.
Yeah.
Right? We're grappling with that, right? How do you be honest about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
About the faults of our own leader, right? And be honest, right, at the same time.
Time out real quick.
Yeah.
We don't have to put this in the video, obviously, but man, I'm just like, I mean, just the more you hash it out, you're like, I mean, yeah, you have Trump himself, that's like the embodiment of all these freaking radioactive, trio of devastation.
Yeah.
But then you have the entire GOP who are constantly deceiving, denying responsibility, and being cynical about the possibility of unity.
That's absolutely.
And defending him constantly.
Yeah. And the cynicism, you know what, the primary phrase that articulated the cynicism about the possibility of unity with respect to Trump was drain the swamp. It's like, look, if there are people in the swamp, I don't just want to drain the swamp. I actually want to rehabilitate the people in the swamp so that they can actually become my allies in the future instead of perpetual enemies, or just flush down some sewer to never be seen again, right? It's, if you look at the way that he treats people that dissent with his agenda and what he wants to do, it's you're out, right? And it's an absolute cynicism about the possibility of unity. It's like, yeah, I know the issues that we grapple with and we deal with. They're huge disagreements. They're radical disagreements. They're absolutely thorny and very difficult to deal with, but they simply can't be resolved with the kind of discourse that we actually have. Certainly with the kind of discourse that assumes that you can just legislate the problems away into oblivion, right? Or that the swamp will somehow agree to be drained because you just heap contempt on them until they just go, hey, let's get out of here.
Yeah. And honestly, I might want to leave that segment in depending on how it goes. So
Sure.
I'll just say
that's fine.
What I want to add to that is, that doesn't come from a place of that. There's no political motivation behind saying that, or saying the GOP is doing whatever or anything like that. It doesn't come from a place of, we're saying we're left and we're condemning the right. trust me, we know
we don't
there's
have
problems.
a home anywhere.
Yeah,
basically. We're homeless.
Yeah. There are problems on both sides. It's a travesty. It's heartbreaking, and so that doesn't come from a place of and if you support the GOP or Trump or anything like that, we're not condemning you or trying to criticize you or cast you down or anything like that. Just
thing like look alive for these dynamics that are actually running throughout the word.
Yeah,
especially if you're a Christian.
Yeah, and going back to we talked about earlier, like why this story is so deeply relevant when you start unpacking all the meanings. That one of the big things there. So
yeah, because there's like nothing wrong there's nothing wrong with wanting to participate in your nation and to make your nation great and say be the best nation that you can be.
Yeah.
But if you actually go back to the word, you'll find God laying out one of the ways, the roadmap for the way that he makes nations great.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's some things in there, like the chapter we're looking at right now, that'll freaking make your eyes bug out of your head, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, and we know that both sides participate in that same thing. And so one of the reasons that we're zeroing in on that specifically, however, is because one of the, at least for me personally, one of the hard things for me to deal with when I was in the church. I mean, I wasn't necessarily affected by it super personally, but it was bothersome seeing, the amount of Christian nationalists and stuff like that out there.
Like
and
uncritical, like swallowing of
Yeah.
everything Trump did. It was
and just like Trump is sent from Jesus and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And it was sickening and hard to deal with. And one of the things that I think, is it puts a barrier between, Christians and skeptics and stuff like that. So, just one of the reasons we're zeroing in on that specifically. But again, it's not like a politically motivated thing. So
yeah, and we mercifully were able to, like at Redeemer where we were. One of the things that was awesome about being at Redeemer is we never had to deal with this kind of blind Christo nationalism that that was just full of basically Trump fanboys. Like I never experienced that. It's when we're talking about our experience of it or encountering it, it was kind of like in the broader narrations that we watched and witnessed kind of in the broader nation.
There was like this Christo
nationalism that just
and then I know
like, what is this?
I know for me, and it got so like kind of terrifying and sickening that it's like anytime I would see things, because I visited different churches and stuff like that. Anytime I would see things that I felt like could remotely resemble that or go down that path, I'd get really queasy and kind of afraid and kind of dip out. Which is says more about me than the churches I was attending this probably, and that I was a little scared and awesome. Had some undressed allergies. Anyway, well, let's continue here.
Yeah, so far from being an act of cruelty, the Abraham and Isaac account in Genesis 22 and the stories that it's nested in produce a roadmap that clarifies the deceitfulness and destructiveness of sin that's so clear that if you learn to locate and grapple with its meanings, the life of an individual, of a family, and a nation can actually be rescued from ruin and personally experience a verdict that radically differs from the verdict that we've rendered about God. Yeah. One example of that, this story actually functioning as a roadmap for the life of an individual, family, and a nation is 2 Samuel 11. It's a story in which David commits adultery with Bathsheba. And one of the things that's remarkable about that story is that David's reign actually functions as the pinnacle and the beginning of the end for Israel in the Old Testament. And the kind of apex of that moment is 2 Samuel 11. It's kind of the famous story where David sends his military out to battle. He sees this gal Bathsheba bathing, and she's married to one of the soldiers named Uriah that he actually sends out into battle. He sends for her, gets her pregnant, and then sends for Uriah because he's impregnated his wife, and then has Uriah murdered. Basically, he sends Uriah back to the front lines with instructions to his commander to run Uriah up to the hottest part of the battle and then run away from him.
Yeah.
And then he dies and he's killed, right?
And I'll let you finish.
Yeah, and then if you sit there and you read 2 Samuel 11, get your antennas up for deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity, because the roadmap for that moment, that is a roadmap that David needed to navigate that moment, existed in the founding stories of his nation. And if he would have paid attention to them and he would have meditated on those stories, he would have went, oh my gosh, I'm engaged in deception. I'm attempting to deny responsibility and I need to stop.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm cynical about the possibility of unity.
Yeah.
I mean, how cynical about the possibility of unity can you be than sneaking off with one of your soldiers' wives and then sending him away with his own death orders? Right.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
And it doesn't take long for the effects of that to just destroy everything. It doesn't even take a generation.
Yeah.
I mean, it's literally his son already. I mean, just everything unravels.
Yeah.
The other thing, going back to the whole theme of it manifests itself as, the murder of God himself, someone who witnesses or who represents the same presence of God or an image bearer of God. Yeah. You told me about this, that Uriah represents the saving presence of God because he's a Hittite.
Yes.
Right?
That's right.
But he's welcomed into Israel. And
that's exactly right.
Yeah, and doesn't say, or the text
and part of Israel's vocation was actually be to a light to the nation in such a way that through Abraham and his offspring, that all the nations of the earth would be blessed. That was one of the ideals that was baked into Abraham's original call. Uriah is actually a fulfillment of that aspiration because for some mysterious reason that we don't know, he decided to cast his lot among the people of Israel. Yeah. And what was tragic about his situation, and I'd love to meet him someday because he sounds like just an awesome guy. What was tragic about his situation is he cast his lot with the people of Israel and trusted them, even to the point where he was willing to lay down his life for their defense. And in reward for his diligence, he was actually murdered.
Yeah. And he shows more character than the king of Israel.
Yeah. Uriah had more character when he was drunk than the
king of Israel when he was sober.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so, David, if you put your finger in the events of 2 Samuel 11 and then you just follow the direct effects, you'll find that like you said, that his family just immediately explodes, right? His son rapes his daughter. Some of the other brothers actually kill Amnon, who raped his sister, right, as revenge for what he did. Absalom participates in an insurrection, boots David out of Jerusalem. Absalom then is killed. In the aftermath of the insurrection, David returns to Jerusalem, but his family's never the same. Solomon is born to Bathsheba as the second child of David and Bathsheba. He goes off into marry 700 wives and 300 concubines. Then he goes into idolatry. And then the rest is history. After the idolatry, they essentially end up eventually baking their own kids, right? Because part of what was bound up with the idolatry that was being brought in was the ritualized burning of your children to death as an act of worship. Yeah. And God basically said, when Israel unwound, and it began, I mean, all the way back in the garden, but in terms of David's situation, he literally missed the roadmap that we're articulating right now. Wasn't paying attention to the founding text of his nation. Yeah. And he killed him.
And going back to what I was saying earlier about how when you sit and think about like, okay, wait a minute, could I be responsible here? And how that affects the way you perceive things. If you come at this the text from a different angle, it's actually a super comforting thing that God resists these people in the text, because it's like, who wouldn't want a God that would resist a nation who's baking their children?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
It's like a very comforting thing. Anyway.
Yeah, like what's the right script? Like if we say, hey, no. He should. What should he do? Sit back and drink lemonade while a nation actually bakes their children in the fire as an act of worship? It's like, no. He does give them grace upon grace upon grace upon grace, because before they were ever founded as a nation, or while they were being founded as a nation, at the very moment they were being founded as a nation, he was actually giving them the very pieces that they would need to actually avoid the calamity that they actually experienced. Yeah. So
crazy,
incredible act of the grace of God. Yeah. So that was the seventh piece. That was probably the largest piece. Yeah. Then the eighth piece is the final piece that we have, right? So the eighth piece that we have of kind of like, how do you put together the mystery of Genesis 22 and what's going on with Abraham and Isaac?
This is mind blowing.
Yeah. So all of these themes that we've been talking about with Abraham and Isaac and the story that it's nested in are anchored and fulfilled in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So I say that you can find these themes in the life of Jesus because one of the things that's absolutely just mind-popping about Jesus is that if you watch his life, one of the things that you'll find out about him is he was never ambivalent or nervous about inhabiting the very world that he'd created for other people. He was never ambivalent about that. Certainly, of course, if you're teaching wisdom and healing people, what's there to be ambivalent about, right?
Yeah.
Right. But
well, and to the extent that he is God, he created everything around him.
That's exactly right.
And he wasn't afraid to show up.
Yeah. That's a huge thing. Yeah, that's so huge. It's not even funny.
Yeah.
So as we're grappling with the whole challenge of becoming visible and becoming subject to justice and wanting the people around us, right, who own the institutions and leaders and everything like that to become visible, one of the questions that's emerging in this journey is, does God who's ultimately responsible for our presence in the world himself become visible, right? So that he's willing to inhabit the world that he himself has made.
Yeah. And
if the answer to that question is yes, then it's game on for the project of becoming visible, right? But if it's not, that is if the one who's ultimately responsible for our presence in the world isn't willing to inhabit the world that he himself has made, then when we demand that other people become visible, we're demanding that they do something that God himself doesn't even do.
We're demanding that they transcend the divine, basically.
Yeah. Or better than God himself even is, right?
Yeah.
And it's a task that's destined to futility, right? Because you're saying, hey, what we really want you to do is be more heroic than God himself.
Yeah. And it's one of the huge things for me when, that I've realized more recently is it's one of the reasons why it's so important for Jesus to be the Son of God. And it's another thing that made me queasy because a lot of progressive Christian literature will cast doubt on whether or not Jesus is the Son of God.
Yeah. And when you say the Son of God, what you mean to imply is that Jesus actually shares the divine nature.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So in this, in a similar way to the fact that you're my son and you reveal my nature, Jesus in a unique sense is the Son of God and reflects who the Father is, right? Because his disciples said, hey, show us the Father. It'll be sufficient for us, right? I think this is in John or something. And he says, yo, have I been with you so long and yet you say, show me the Father? He said, he who has seen me has seen the Father.
Yeah. And so that this idea of chucking God out the window as the Son of God always made me queasy. And recently I've figured out why, and that's because what he just said. Yeah, if God himself doesn't do it, then why can you call other people? Why can you demand that other people be visible if God himself doesn't do it? That
has become visible by being willing to inhabit the very world that you yourself have created. And what's a kicker about God is that will actually that will entail him experiencing forms of suffering that he wasn't obligated to enter into because he didn't cause the reasons for the suffering.
Yeah.
He was actually the target that was produced by the suffering, or the malevolence that actually produced the suffering.
Yeah.
And he said, hey, I'm actually going to inhabit that world, even if it entails experiencing forms of suffering that I've never experienced before and don't even deserve to take on myself, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's how you can see like how in Jesus's life, these themes are captured and actually fulfilled in his life. You also see these themes fulfilled in his death. For example, one of the ways that you actually see this fulfilled in his death is because in his death, he actually stands face to face with God's right to subject us to futility because of what we're aimed at, right?
Just unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
He stands in the face of God's right to thwart our murderous desire for him.
And intentions,
And to turn our quest for mortal vengeance against God into a futile endeavor.
Futile task. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because if God essentially cedes reality to our desire to kill him, then it's not only the end of God, but it's the end of everything that depends on him as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And throughout the word, this is another kind of layer to the texture of sin and the way that the Bible describes it. That sin isn't just this like this trio cocktail, if you will, that we've mentioned of deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity that's actually aimed at the murder of God. It's also a disposition of soul that seeks to disintegrate God's own. And when I say disintegrate, I mean pull apart God's creation and the beauty that it actually possesses. There's a desire to actually pull apart what God had actually put together in creation.
Mm-hmm.
And so for God to actually subject those intentions to futility, and the people who embody those intentions, isn't an act of cruelty or perversity. It's actually an act of kindness that's aimed at vindicating God's own integrity and the integrity of his own creation, right? But in Jesus's death, he actually stands face to face with God's right to subject us to futility, and he himself experiences futility and death so that we can actually go free. In his death, he's also judging Pilate, right? Who's engaged in deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity, and then liberating the penitent thief who himself had been captive in his own history to deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity. Because one of the things that you'll find is, as you read the cross narrative, is that Jesus is crucified next to two thieves or bandits, right? And when they say thieves, in the Roman context, they're not just talking about people that will walk around and pickpocket pocket change out of people. There are people that were being crucified because they would stand next to trade routes and major travel routes that people were traveling on. They'd ambush them, take their stuff, and then in some cases, they would actually kill the people that they were actually assaulting and taking their stuff. So Rome, in an attempt to protect its trade routes and its roads, they would make a public spectacle of people who are engaged in banditry and thievery.
Yeah. So you don't just have, a white collar thief who's stealing some stuff here and there. No, you're talking about people who are violent, assaulting people who are going about their way.
Yeah. And if you literally just think about his vocation as a thief before he encounters Jesus, it's deception. I guarantee you, he didn't sit along the side of the road with a sign that said,
"We will ambush you."
Yes, I'm a thief. I'd like to ambush you, and if possible, take your life. Right? It was sneaky. He had to engage in deception, right? Because he wanted what they had, and he didn't want to pay for it. He had to engage in denied responsibility, because after you thief, you don't just fall on the ground and say, "Oh, please punish me for my malevolence and my cruelty," right? And then cynicism about the possibility of unity, because he didn't go up and say, "Hey, I'm in need. Can you help me?" He didn't. He just forcibly took what he wanted.
Yeah, and then not only does he deny responsibility by not he doesn't sit on the ground and bellyache about what he's done afterwards and go, "Oh, I'm terrible," but also he could take responsibility and said, "Yo, there are better ways to make a living. There are better, more honest ways to make a living here. I don't need to assault people to become wealthy."
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah.
And so what's a kicker is, when he meets Jesus, he only has a few moments with Jesus. And it's actually possible that one of the reasons that he actually gets turned on to who Jesus is and responds to him is because he was actually on trial the same day Jesus was, and was in queue overhearing what Jesus was talking to Pilate. And as he's watching Jesus take his journey to crucifixion, he's going, "Holy cow, this guy is way more than what they're alleging about this guy." Like, he says he came to bear witness of the truth and so on and so forth. And his kingdom's not of this world. It's like, as he just watched him, he's like, this guy's way more than what these people are alleging. They're treating him like a thug, but I'm the one that's the thug, right? And I'm the one that deserves to die. But what's like so mind-popping and just so beautiful, it's such a beautiful picture of God's purposes for people that have been snared in deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity, as that instead of going down the same trail that the thief had always been going around, he inverts, right? Abraham and Isaac's story is a journey of inversion, of inverting the original folly. The thief, he does the same thing, right? Because he actually speaks the truth and takes responsibility. He says this. He tells the other thief who's mocking Jesus, he says, "Yo, don't talk to him like that, because he hasn't done anything wrong. And we're getting what we deserved," taking responsibility. "But don't talk to this man that way. He hasn't done anything wrong," right? Speaking the truth and taking responsibility. And then he expresses a hope in the possibility of unity, because he says, Remember me when you come into your kingdom," right? Yeah. And Jesus, what's really cool is the man who is literally the moral offscouring of Roman society ends up having an affinity to the very nature of God himself that's so astonishing that Jesus actually meets it.
Yeah.
Right? He meets the speaking truth and taking responsibility and hope about the possibility of unity, because, like, remember what one of the things that Jesus, one of his prayers that he prayed while people are just treating him like garbage, and you were actually crucified naked. This is like a public humiliation. One of the most excruciating ways to die and shameful ways to die is die a naked man who's being crucified. And what does he do? He actually prays to the Father, and he said, of the people. He prayed of the people who were actually crucifying him and engaged in the most heinous, atrocious injustice of all time. He says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. And he's inverting too, as well, because at the moment of humanity's absolute debasement, and they're in the deepest depths of their perversity and contempt for God, he is actually expressing a hope in the possibility of unity by praying to the Father for their good. That's a kicker.
Yeah. Makes you want to burst into tears.
I know, it's insane. Yeah. And he actually, and so he actually justifies the nature of his claim by swinging into what appears to be one of the most obscene stories in the entire Bible. And he captures its themes and he fulfills them in his own person and work.
Yeah. And in the case of the thief, it's such a seemingly, I mean, it's like literally like a couple sentences or something like that. And it's such a seemingly small act.
It's crazy.
But it's also it's so mind-blowingly huge and significant, and took so much of that man to do that and to say it. And it's so, it's an inversion of everything that got humanity to this point in the first place.
Yeah.
And that's all Jesus needs.
Yeah.
That's all he needs. And he says, I'll remember you today in paradise.
That's exactly right.
With me in paradise.
That's exactly right. And and his interaction with the thief is like this promise that even though I'm encountering a person who's plunged the depths of the very folly that has brought humanity into the depths of its misery, and this man into the depths of his misery, I'm going to have mercy on this man, and I'm going to make him a new person, right? I'm going to make this man something radically different than who Adam was and who he formerly was. And he does that throughout the course of his entire ministry. And then to top it off, he's not just crucified, but he's risen from the dead, because he's embodying God's promise that everyone who is united to him by faith, that is united to Jesus by faith, is actually going to participate in the same triumph over the tyranny of death that Jesus did when he was raised from the dead.
Yeah. And, I'm just going to talk a little bit about, because one thing for me too is like, hearing the salvation story 50,000 times growing up in the church, it just lost significance. You're like, I get that, we pray and all this stuff, but why is it so significant? And, we repent of our sins and all that stuff. And on one level, I get that it's important, because I know it's admirable to be humble and all that kind of stuff. And, I don't want to be like a pig-headed monster, but I also, I didn't grasp the gravity of what's going on in salvation. And, I think it's one of the reasons why it's so important to revisit it with such so much scrutiny and stuff like that. But like, it's just mind blowing that, it just makes so much sense that essentially all God is asking you to do is to take responsibility, and he'll handle everything else. If you just speak
the truth and take responsibility.
Yeah.
And you can actually present yourself to God as a subject of justice, because the God who is actually telling the story isn't just a just God. He's also a merciful God.
Yeah.
Right. And you see that with Joseph's brothers, right? Joseph's brothers in Genesis 44:16, where they're before Joseph, and they're like, oh, frick, we're sitting in front of this ruler in Egypt, and we screwed up big time, like our brother Benjamin did, but we're all just frickin' screwed. And what God is going to do, because he's remembered our guilt, that is what we did to our brother Joseph, he's going to force us to be slaves in the very same land that we forced Joseph, our brother, to be slaves
forcing them to live in the world that they created brothers. Yeah.
That's exactly right. That's what they were afraid. They were afraid that God is perfectly just. But again, if they would have went back to the founding story, right, Genesis 22, that their own grandfather had been telling, they would have realized God isn't just a God who's asserting his right to justice that is to mortally oppose, but he's also a God who's willing to say, don't touch that lad. Right? And through Joseph, God is actually Joseph is actually mediating the mercy of God to his brothers.
Yeah.
And they've got the justice part right. They're absolutely right that God could do that, because all he would be doing is by making them slaves in Egypt is one, giving Joseph a great opportunity for payback. He'd be using Joseph as a means of actually forcing Joseph's brothers to actually bear the same burdens that they forced Joseph to bear.
Yeah.
And for some reason, I would say it's because God loves mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment.
Yeah.
He says, no, you can actually go free. And so Joseph mediates the very nature of God.
Yeah.
Because he's not just wanting justice.
Yeah.
Because at the very moment they become visible, he says,
Yeah.
Okay, I want to give you
And-
mercy, right? And
Yeah.
they're reconciled.
For sure. And again, going back to the progressive Christianity thing, another thread that kind of I see commonly there is this idea that everyone is saved.
Yeah.
And you know, it at a surface, or I guess at a surface level, it's a desirable thing. And I think even the word talks about that too. 'Cause
God desires all to be saved.
yeah. But again, once you, it just papers over the significance of the deception, denied responsibility, and the cynicism about the possibility of unity. And that's not to say that God won't chase somebody
Yeah.
constantly and just shower grace upon grace upon grace on
That's
somebody
right.
who's constantly engaged in that. But he's also not obligated to rescue someone who insists on constantly deceiving, denying responsibility, and being cynical about the possibility of unity. It's just ridiculous that he would owe that,
Yeah.
to someone who's constantly, he's essentially saying, here, this is what you want, I'll give it to you. If you want to be responsible,
That's right.
you can be responsible.
Yeah. And so if you essentially want to adopt that disposition or that trio, that destructive trio, that's actually, it's not just an act, but it's actually a disposition of soul towards God, even to the point of death, where you're faced with the loss of everything, you still want to hold on to that disposition. Be aware that you can actually be granted, you can be given the right to possess that disposition.
Yeah.
And to just be given that, to be given essentially exactly what you want.
Yeah.
But that disposition is essentially an act of demanded loneliness.
Yeah.
And God would rather you be the recipient of mercy.
Yeah.
Than to be forced to bear all the same burdens that you placed on others.
Yeah. Crazy. Crazy powerful stuff.
Yeah. It's good stuff.
Yeah. For sure. And it
all that from Adventure Quest.
Yeah. Oh, it's just wild. Yeah, it's just wild. And going back to our first section, when we just left we read the quote about the consequences, and we kind of left that hanging in the air. That's weighty stuff, but without the rest of the story, you can't find rest in your actions and stuff like that. You need this other part of the story. But yeah, I also love the not just the pattern of mortal opposition, but the pattern of grace after grace after grace after grace.
Yeah.
Because
it's all over the place.
Yeah. Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. And even after Cain just got done splitting his brother's head open or whatever happened, God says, he prescribes his punishment, and Cain says, oh, my punishment is too great to bear. Surely I'll die. And God's like, you just killed your brother. What are you bellyaching about? But he still says, no.
I'll put a mark on your forehead.
Yeah.
Right.
And basically I'll prevent people from harming you. And if they do, I'll judge them.
Yeah.
And it's just, grace upon grace upon grace. And then, Ahab, after he, is that right? King
Ahab went after Naboth's vineyard.
Yeah. And then God sent him a messenger and said, the mouths of your prophets are full of lying spirits or whatever.
Yeah.
That
he told him exactly what was up.
Yeah.
He's like, yo, you've been ruling, you've attempted, this is a story from 1 Kings 21 and 22. Super incredible story.
Yeah.
But it's a story essentially where an Israelite king who's running off into idolatry and just going crazy, he sees a garden that belonged to one of his fellow citizens named Naboth, and he wants the garden. Naboth won't give it to him because he can't. It's supposed to be passed down. His land is supposed to be passed down generation to generation, and it's not supposed to be commodified. So he won't, and he can't sell it to Ahab. And Ahab gets all pouty, and his wife Jezebel says, hey, just round up some scoundrels and have them accuse him of blaspheming God and the king, and then bury him with rocks, right? And so Ahab actually does that. He rules by lies. He engages in deception, denied responsibility, and cynicism about the possibility of unity. It expresses itself in the attempt to murder Naboth, and he does murder Naboth by speaking lies. And this is all in 1 Kings 21. And then in 1 Kings chapter 22, Ahab's like, hey, he wants to go out into battle, but he wants some people who have contact with the divine to tell him whether his plans are going to be successful or not. His prophets, they're all, hey, go up because God's going to prosper you, yada, yada, yada. Which, by the way, is prophets who are essentially tacitly admitting that their God isn't aware that he's actually just murdered someone by lies, right? And then he goes, hey, wait, let's see if there's a prophet of the Lord around, because he was a wee bit nervous that they were being too flattering, right? Maybe there's a trap set for me or whatever. And then Micaiah says, hey, go up, for the Lord's going to prosper you. And he's like, well, what do I need to do to ensure that you're actually telling me the truth? Because you're often speaking ill of me and not good. He's like, actually, to tell you the truth, the Lord said to his council, hey, who's going to persuade Ahab to go up into battle? And some lying spirits presented themselves before the Lord and said, hey, we'll go be a lying spirit in the mouth of Ahab's prophets to persuade him to go up into battle to die. And God says, okay, go ahead and do that. And all that God is doing, this is again one of those weird stories in the Bible where it's like, is God being weird or malevolent here? This seems really weird, right? All God is doing is he's actually compelling Ahab to live under the shade of the very tree that he's planted. In the chapter before, Ahab has explicitly stated, I want to rule by lies, even if I have to murder somebody to rule by lies, or even if somebody has to die to prop up my lies, the lies that I'm telling. In the very next chapter, God says, okay, you want to rule by lies? I'm actually the real sovereign, right? And I'm going to send lying spirits. And he literally tells Ahab what's going on and what he's going to do.
And he still shows mercy to Ahab when he tells him exactly what's going on and that he's being lied to by his prophets.
Because he could have just decided, I need to not go up. I need to repent, but he didn't. Yeah. He just freaking pig-headed.
Which is crazy that even though he had that fear that his prophets were lying to him, then he gets an admission that his prophets are lying to him, and he still doesn't listen to it. It's just
and
it's
he goes
crazy.
Up.
Yeah, but that's the beautiful thing is when I think about this, I can't think of a single time like in the text where God just wipes somebody out of the blue, like, bolt of lightning without giving them just astounding amounts of grace.
He does.
It wouldn't even take you a message from God himself to go, oh, maybe this isn't such a good idea, but he still gives that to Ahab.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, you see that with the Egyptians, right? And in the Exodus story, right? This is another passage that's absolutely famous for God allegedly being malevolent. Well, we talked about the Joseph story and how a little bit about the Joseph story, but one of the things that central features of the Joseph story is that God actually rescues the entire nation of Egypt from death by famine through somebody that they're actually oppressing and enslaving, right? He repays, Joseph is God's repayment of good for the evil that the Egyptians did to him. And he's giving, Joseph is like the embodied mercy of God for the people of Egypt. Years later, they forget about the mercy that God gave them through Joseph. And they say, they realize that, and this is in the first chapter of Exodus, they realize, these people, that is the Israelites, are becoming fruitful and multiplying. We need to actually take care of this and enslave them, because if we get into a battle, they're going to actually turn on us and kill us, right? And so what they do is they actually enslave them for anywhere from 275 to 400 years, right? But it's based on an expression of deception. These people are worthy of being enslaved. No, they're not. They had given you a gift, denied responsibility. They refused to be their brother's keeper. They're articulating the same disposition towards Israel that Cain displayed towards his brother. And then cynicism about the possibility of unity
with Israel.
Yeah, that's right. And then God gives him grace upon grace upon grace. He tells him what's going to happen.
Exactly. And he has all these plagues that happen before he kills their firstborn, which is exactly the world they prescribe for Israel.
That's right.
It's crazy. It's like there's this, it's like God is saying, if you're going to act in the world, then you need to, live under the shade of the tree that you planted. Essentially,
you need to be prepared to actually live in the world that you've made for others.
Yeah.
And that's what eye popped me about the story of the race was, I was like, wait a second. This whole dynamic about becoming visible is the central question about justice. It is, when you act in the world, what does your actions actually mean?
Yeah.
And when you act in the world, your actions are actually a description of the type of world that you're seeking to make. Once you do that, once you act in the world, there's a live question that goes, that's issued to you, right, by justice itself. Are you prepared? And I would say ultimately God himself, are you prepared to live in the same world that you've made for others?
Yeah.
And if you're not, you need to think twice about what it is you're actually doing when you act in the world.
Yeah. And
right.
Yeah, I think we could probably wrap it up here.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, but one last thing I want to add, because one thing that we've talked about that we want to make a habit of in our talks and in these episodes and stuff like that is not only casting a critical eye out there, but also casting a critical eye in here.
Yeah.
obviously, because that's kind of the big theme here. And one of those things for me personally is that I realized recently is I can see myself in the Cain and Abel story, when he just got done murdering his brother and God hands him his punishment and he bellyaches that his punishment is too intense to bear. And it's like, I can so easily see myself doing that, And so, yeah, I think, when you're hearing these stories, definitely just remember that you're capable of the exact same thing. Don't think that you're above this or that or whatever.
Yeah, take it easy on the rascals, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We actually might be one of them, right?
Yeah. But yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.